So good afternoon and a very warm welcome on behalf of the RWE for Decisions initiative and the Belgian National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, INAMI RISIV, to this first public meeting of the initiative to discuss realising the potential of real-world evidence for learning healthcare systems. My name is Jackie Davis. I'll have the privilege of moderating our discussion this afternoon, where we're going to have a couple of interactive debates as we consider how to support the use of real-world evidence to inform health technology assessments, the bodies who make those assessments and the payers' decisions, and also to enable that learning healthcare system that we need in order to improve patient outcomes. And all of this based on learnings from concrete case studies. You're going to hear much more about that shortly. Brief outline of the programme: we're going to have a keynote to set the context for our discussion, and then two panels. Each panel will start with a short opening presentation, brief opening remarks by the panelists, then there will be questions both from me and then later on, I hope, from you. We have asked a few people to help kickstart our discussions in each case, so I will go to them first and then bring the rest of you in. Just housekeeping as to how you join the discussion. You're all muted at the moment. If you want to ask a question, you can do it in one of two ways. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write your question. Could I ask you please to make them short and to the point so I can see easily who your question is to and what it is. Maybe I could suggest Twitter length or less. But if you want to ask your question orally, there's a little raised hands button. If you put your hand up, I will, to the extent that time allows, give you the floor. Just to stress, for written questions, it's the Q&A button, not the chat button. The chat button is if you're having some technical difficulties, you can't hear us, you can't see us, or you need to communicate in some way with the organisers, please use that. But I'm not looking at that box, so please, if you want to communicate with me and get me to put your questions to our speakers, Q&A box it is. Couple of last things before I introduce our keynote. The Twitter hashtag is RWE4, number 4 decisions, the name of the initiative. Please do share with the outside world what you are hearing at this event. Let's get that real world evidence message out. And please also note that this event is being live streamed on the RWE for Decisions website, and it is being recorded for internal follow-up purposes. That's enough practicality. Let's get to substance. And I am delighted to welcome Andre Rees, Director for Health Systems, Medical Products and Innovation in DG Santé in the European Commission, to open proceedings with a keynote talking about the EU health data space and cross-country collaboration in real-world evidence. Andre, it's great to have you with us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Janet. So, welcome also everybody for this interesting and important workshop. So let me focus on the on data and the European health data space. I will start from reminding us that in the recent report of State of Health in the EU, which was published end of last year, we focus on a number of issues. One of them about the digital transformation of in the field of health promotion, this is prevention. And it was concluded that only fundamental rethinking of the health and the health system can help with the implementation. And at the same time, the health reforms, you know, they should continue to be based on the principles we still strong believe they apply: resilience, accessibility, and effectiveness, because they can provide, you know, better quality care for all European citizens. We also know that digital solutions and this new word I also am learning, datafication trend, can increase the well-being of citizens and help also to pass radical changes we can see in today world and today health systems. I think the crisis, COVID crisis, show, you know, even more, you know, why we need this kind of rethinking. The access of to data to track development of disease, the COVID-19 disease, exchange of knowledge, learning, communicating with patients, communicating between health professionals, making access to clinical evidence. All these new factors really were not discovered through COVID, but really showed that we need to, very quickly move to the different paradigm. One of the main priorities of the European Commission, announced already end of last year by our president, also in the designation letter for our commissioner, was the creation of the European health data space as a part of the European strategy for data, which was adopted end of February this year. The European health data space should able to use or reuse health data, first for health provisions, for better research and innovation, for better policy making. This will also strengthen the access and portability of citizens' data to eliminate the barrier for the cross-border provision of digital health. So this ambition program. So how are we going to do this? For our work, we would like to structure this work on several pillars. The first, governance and rules. Second, quality of data. The third, infrastructure and technical interoperability. And lastly, the capacity building and digital upskilling. Because finally, I often say in my discussions that without people, machines will still not do the job for us. The Commission is currently working with member states and stakeholders to define the best governance structure and set up appropriate infrastructure for the European health data space. The part of this effort was addressed through a number of meetings we started, almost together with COVID crisis. Which also create additional challenge for our work, but we are able to organize series of workshops with presidents of member states and experts in number of fields like data policy, national interpretation of GDPR in health sector, the different models of dealing with data in different member states, because what is great about European Union that we can learn from each other. So of course we did study and we continue to study a number of innovative solutions in member states. We are currently launching the expert study on regulatory gaps and barriers to cross-border provision of digital health. People sometimes believe it's better use e-health, but we prefer to use digital health for services and products, and also adoption of the different provisions, regulatory provision in relation to artificial intelligence in healthcare sector. This is also other important field of our work, also announced by our president in the current speech, State of Union. The main findings of the studies will be taken into account in preparation of the concept of European health data space, which is planned to adopt next year. Of course, there will be a number of interactions. So I think also this workshop is a great momentum for our learning curve. The work of the Commission, of course, should be somehow coordinate together with member states, because as I already said, there are a number of developments in member states we have to adapt into the system, and of course later the system should be adaptable, across Union. The number of developments I'd like to mention, because they are important to keep in our discussion today. We have already developed the system for exchange of electronic data. We have e-prescription, patient summary through so-called myhealth.eu, which is helping already 7 member states to interact and send data across borders. We continue to work on the implementation of the recommendation for electronic health record exchange format, which will facilitate exchange of electronic health records across borders. Today, 7 member states already started this, but 25 together are committed to implement this system in next years. Other example of implementation of cross-border and EU-wide solution is work of European reference networks, 24 networks. They're using one platform for exchanging data, so-called CPMS, which allowed over 1,000 consultation of patients with the use of the data, often quite big medical records share across border between experts from many countries. They also build registers for each network. We have a project to build registries of diseases. A recent example, which I'd like to share with you, is less known about the support of European Commission and so-called ESI Fund to work on the convalescence plasma platform, which Commission is working together with European Blood Alliance to build database for the collection of data and on donation and patient outcome. This is really something which we really feel this is remind in the definition of real world data. We have additional work on the so-called 1 million genome initiatives with 20 member states working together to create the platform to cooperate. European Medicine Agency, together with heads of medicine agencies, published important document about big data. But I think today in workshop, Peter Alle would tell us more about this approach. And also we continue to work with European Medicine Agency, national agencies, but also with ECDC on the way how those two agencies can be incorporated in the European health data space work. As you know, we also proposed the HTA proposal as a commission. And it is important to see the real world evidence as a part of our current and future work on HTA. It's not about the joint assessment at the time of launch, but also in the post-launch evidence, which of course will include the real world evidence. So this is other important part of our development in this field on the European level. And I will conclude, in the important interaction between us and stakeholders. We have eHealth Stakeholders Group, which is the place when we brought together stakeholders in the field of digital health, industry, health professionals, standardization bodies, but also a number of other parties. So this is one place, but there's also continue interaction with stakeholders, gain knowledge, learn more, and produce better results. So we are not in the beginning of this journey, but we are still in the conceptualization phase of this work. So I'm very happy to join you today, and I will be online, and I hope also together with you conclude this meeting today evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre, and indeed we look forward to hearing from you again at the end of the session. So underlining there that broader context of the plans for an EU health data space within which our conversation today about real-world data and real-world evidence is taking place. You talked about the importance of real-world evidence and also the importance of interaction between stakeholders and with policymakers. We're going to talk about both in our first panel when we focus on sharing experiences with real-world evidence to date and identifying the challenges, and later on when we talk about the potential for an EU learning network on real-world evidence and discuss what such a network might look like and how it might operate. So lots to come, but thank you very much, Andre, and we look forward to hearing from you again a little bit later on. So, as I say, we're going to start our first panel, and our first panel is on experience to date in using real-world evidence. What do we know? We're going to hear a little bit about what people have been doing, and I'll try to identify some of the challenges to take that work forward and potentially realize all the potential that real world evidence might have in certain conditions in the future. So we're going to talk about what role can real world data play, and what role can this evidence play in assessing the value of treatments for patients in healthcare systems? What does it take to be able to use it and enable decisions by HTAs and by payers? And what do we need to do if we are to get there and enable it to support scientific advice and novel outcomes-based reimbursement approaches? As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to have a context-setting presentation first by the man who has been behind this initiative, the thought leader in the multi-stakeholder real-world evidence for decisions initiative. He's from the Belgian National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, our host today. And so he's going to tell us a little bit about the work they've been doing and set the context. Then I will introduce our panel and we'll get the discussion away. Feel free to keep your questions coming in as he talks. Joe will be joining the panel afterwards, so if you have questions, I'll put them to him later. But Joe, a very warm welcome. Thank you for having us. And over to you, sir, to kick off this first panel.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Jackie, for introducing me. And thanks also a lot for Andrew Rees to mention the initiatives which were taken on the European side. And of course, we are all together in the same boat and in the same journey in order to clarify a little bit the role and the possibilities on real-world data and real-world evidence. We all know that, of course, there are still huge challenges in the field of real-world data gathering, real-world data construction, biases, the governance of all this. But nevertheless, we see also the opportunities which can be offered by using this capacity of real-world data and real-world evidence. And the question is, which role real-world data and real-world evidence can play in the future? And therefore, as CEO of the Belgian social health insurance system, we are not simply blind payers, we are also thinkers and trying to get some forecast about the challenges, but also the possibilities of making more clear and evidence-based decisions in the field of reimbursing new innovative medicines and truly innovative medicines. And our question was, in which way or how can we deal a little bit our concerns with many stakeholders from patient side, from industry side, from colleagues of HTA agencies, from other member states, and with the European Commission. All the stakeholders could be mentioned, clinicians also. And 3 years ago, next slide please, 3 years ago we launched initiatives to set up, can I have the next slide please, to the initiative for a series of activities which we had as concern to get more insight in the field of real-world data. And the first one was a simple paper, but nevertheless it's a little bit outdated, but nevertheless it was the foundation to see, okay, what is the possible use of real-world data throughout the innovative medicine life cycle, knowing that, of course, real-world data is coming as both as on the regulatory side, but also at the stage, this is the moment after market authorization and post-market launch. The second paper we discussed, and it's are the conclusions of this multi-stakeholder discussions, was linked directly with the aim of getting more insight on the place real-world evidence could play in outcomes-based pricing and reimbursement decisions. As you know, managed entry agreements, of course, are having a great place now and a bigger place in decision-making for health payers. And the question was, okay, one of the criticism is this managed entry agreement are still oriented only on a financial basis, but can we orient it also on an outcome basis? And when we are talking about outcomes, in which way we can be guided by real-world data and real-world evidence, knowing, of course, that there are strict limitations. It was not from the new normal, as we said in this paper, but it should have a chance. It could have a chance in different circumstances we clearly defined in our paper, oriented to specific pathologies and so on. And I think it's important to say, okay, having in the forefront the necessity to have more evidence-based decision-making for new innovative medicines. The question is, of course, can we make this managed entry agreements more flexible? Can we have more data and see it over a longer period? Of course, starting, and it was one of the conclusions also of this paper, we should start at the forehand, not making it as a policy and as a payer solely, but together with stakeholders and together, of course, with regulators. Start early dialogues and pick up what are the payers' concerns, and I will come back on what are our specific concerns. And therefore, of course, there are interlinkages, of course, during the whole life cycle, as we have put forward in the first paper. The third initiative was to making it more practice. We are not a think tank. We are not an academic consortium, but we are people who are coming from different backgrounds, supported also by academia, let's be clear, but to have sufficient action-oriented approaches. And one of them was, okay, can we construct and can we build a tool for reducing uncertainties in the evidence generation of specialized treatments for rare diseases? And this study was published in Orphanet. It was guided by Amr McCarty and Professor Annemans. And you can see that when you are looking at that paper, that is give a checklist a little bit, but also good guidance in order to build sufficiently evidence which is needed without biases and without compromises. It was clearly that real-world evidence cannot, of course, lower the robust evidence we need for a market authorization on the one side. That's not our concern in the first place, but also, of course, for decision-making after market launch. And the last one is the project which is going on is about the multi-stakeholder initiative, which we call real-world data for decision-making, and knowing in which way we can bring on board this ideas of real-world data with the regard of what are the essential guidance which is needed and the essential principles which should be respected. And we did it on a practical basis, trying to define for the different stakeholders also a little bit their action points in order to come to what we have called a practical learning network. I will not going into detail. Karen Facey will give an overview about the paper which was published and she coordinated, and I'm very grateful for that, in the official Journal of Health Technology, International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare. And I think we will come back on that, and I will also go into detail of the basic principles.
Joe, can I ask you to speed up a little bit? We're very tight on time today because we're in the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, the question is, of course, why a health payer is launching such an initiative. And it's clear, the first question is, how can we reduce our uncertainty, which are at the moment of market launch, especially in the field when clinical trials and clinical data are insufficient to respond to payers' needs. The second question is the question which is putting a lot of pressure on payers, is how we can narrow the gap between outcome oriented approaches and the clinical benefits in practice. It's not because outcomes are projected that they will be also realized in clinical practice. And narrowing this gap is, I think, a great endeavor. Third one, of course, we are also confronted with the use of what I call fast-track success procedure, which is, of course, also putting some pressure on the evidence-based which is behind. The outcomes-oriented managed agreement I mentioned already, and of course the opportunity of the digitalization itself, as Emma wrote somewhere, science progresses faster than the system. How can we also have narrowing this gap? And last but not least, of course, we are also seeing that a lot of policy initiatives are taken. The last one is the pharmaceutical strategy of the European Union, in which, of course, it's clearly said that we should have more insight in this real-world data for the regulatory framework, I will add, and also for the payer decisions we should bring on board. And of course, another opportunity is the health data space. Next slide, please. I will not go into detail, but you can see that also member states in a council conclusions are coming back again and again to this question, but also setting, okay, that using real-world data and social data should be done with respect of data protection, ethical principles, and of course without biases in the decision-making itself. Next slide, please. And the question is, the first question we considered in the stakeholder discussions of the last topic I pointed out is which answers are needed. And it's clear that that the basic question is, can we agree about the real-world data which could support pricing and reimbursement decisions? And it's clear that there is a lack of some elements which are not always present at market launch. It's the question about the populations to be treated, the natural history of the disease, the size, the durability of the clinical effects compared to treatment alternatives, the budget impact, quit with multi-complex chronic conditions and multiple chronic therapeutic options and switches and so on. This place and need for more evidence and of course to see, okay, what endpoints are measurable, also taking into regard the experiences of patients, which we are considering also as an important issue. It's not mentioned on the slide, but I stress it very well. It's an important element which should be brought on board, and was also clearly stated out that quality of life, of course, are elements which we should also include in decision making. Next slide, please.
Really quick now, if you could, Joe. Sorry.
Yeah, I will finish. What do we need to make progress? It's co-creation with different stakeholders, and you will see on the slide, and everybody will get the slides. Next slide, please. That, of course, from the different sides and different stakeholders are posing different questions. It's our duty to bring them together, to integrate them, and to organize them in a way that we can get a core data set. Next slide, please. One of the important issues is, of course, when we are in favor of, next slide please, when we are in favor of learning network, next slide please.
Can we change?
Yes, okay. It's a question, okay, on which principles we have to build such initiatives. I think there are two basic key principles. The first one is collaboration. Collaboration in which we have to stress that real world evidence and real data generation is a shared responsibility and should be, of course, pre-specified and planned with all the stakeholders. Another one is that, of course, collaboration needs iterative dialogues, which involve all the stakeholders throughout the life cycle of a technology to discuss the evidence plans, evidence generation plans, and clarify the potential of real-world evidence to resolve these decision uncertainties, which we have pointed out. And of course, each stakeholder has to take the responsibility for aspects he can influence. A second principle is a transparency. We have to clarify which questions may be able to address in regulatory and payer decisions. We have to publish methods for critical assessment of real-world evidence. We have to share information, and we have to use clear processes for managing also conflicts of interest among the different stakeholders. And we have to agree what the real-world data can be collected, and of course, under which conditions. And what do we need to make progress? Our conclusion was that a practical proposal could be, it's only one element, of course, to make progress. It's a learning network, an action-oriented network in which we share case studies. We have done that last week on the 10th of September with some firms and different stakeholders were present. Enable, of course, these dialogues are already mentioned, and also provide guidance or patient-oriented elements can be supported to co-design studies. And of course, we believe that this learning network should be objective, should be owned or with a governance by a public institution, enable this interaction, and of course, should be also sustainable. And we will come back on later on when other people are coming in to clarify how we can make it more concrete. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, and so much to discuss. So sorry for hurrying you a little bit, but I want to bring in our panel, lots of issues to discuss. And as you say, we'll talk about the potential learning network later. But here, coming to your crucial question about what role can real-world evidence play? What are the circumstances in which it is appropriate? What are the challenges that need to be addressed to answer some of those concerns? Thank you for highlighting that so very well in your opening. Let's bring in our other panelists. And panelists, please, could you put your cameras back on and your mics when I introduce you? Peter Mol, Professor of Drug Regulatory Science, University Medical Centre of Groningen, and Clinical Assessor at the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board. He's also Vice Chair of EMA's Scientific Advice Working Party, to give us a methodologist, a regulator's perspective. Etienne Yusum, who is Head of Market Access, Cell and Gene Europe at Novartis, to bring the industry perspective. And Adrian Jonas, Associate Director for Data and Analytics at the UK National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, known as NICE, to bring us an HTA perspective. So the format now will be, we've asked our panelists just to make opening remarks of 3 to 4 minutes, no more if you would, panelists, and please forgive me if I gently but firmly have to remind you your time is up, and then we'll launch the discussion. I see there are some questions already coming in. We'll take those as we go along. But first, let's hear from our panelists. So Peter, kick us off if you would, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and the interesting discussion. Obviously, real-world evidence is becoming increasingly important to the regulator as well. Although the experience and the actual use of it in our decision-making is mainly from the area of post-marketing. So I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective also on the clinical development program. And to give you that perspective, it's good to know I'm in the Scientific Advice Working Party, seeing about 70 development programs every month, and we discuss those for 40 days with 70 experts from 18 countries in the European context. The other experience I have with the use of real world evidence is in my role as the chair of the task force on registries, where we try to bring not just the company together with the regulator, but we also try to engage with the registry owners to really make sure that we use as much as possible data from existing disease registries. So talking of the connecting and the sharing of information is then very critical. The questions that are asked to us as regulators are often, if companies come forward with their programs and their plans to use real world evidence, is in the context of, well, could we use the data to contextualize the single arm trial results that we have and explain why these effects that we have observed in the trial are meaningful. They are also often used in the context of more in the post-licensing. So we have approved the drug and the data is intended to add new information. And that could be on maintenance of efficacy. We saw an effect on a surrogate, but we want to see long-term. Equally, long-term safety is often not very well known. And also increasingly, the real world is proposed in context of extrapolating information. And I will come to a couple of examples in a minute. What is key to the regulator, and I'm really going to stress that each time that I talk in the outside world, is that we want to have an objective. We want to have the design of the study with that. We want to see the data then only after we've had a clear objective, why do we choose for this type of data? And then the analysis should be appropriate and should be fine-tuned. It should not be the other way around. You should not have the data available, do an analysis, find a nice result, come back, fine-tune the results and come, or the analysis and come to us. So we've seen it in the context of rare diseases to extend the indication, for instance, where real-world evidence was proposed in terms of a comparative effectiveness study versus standard of care, where there was some single-arm trial data available scattered across the drug development and over time that these data were generated, was PK modeling. But I must admit, the regulatory authorities, our CHMP said at the end, no, just give us the trial data, even if scattered, give us the PK modeling. We're not so convinced that the real-world evidence will be key in our decision-making. In the setting of oncology, where we have, for instance, change in formulations, drug already approved maybe in the US, and where there is a link on looking at the real-world data to show the formulation effects, for instance, from 1 to 2 times daily administration routes changing, and also maybe a long-term modified release. There was some interest in these data, but ultimately, again, in discussing and trying to fine-tune what is the role of these data, yes, it could add, it could be supportive, but preferred a randomized controlled trial. And so in the setting of gene therapies, we see also real-world evidence. There it is embraced in terms of, but again, in post-licensing setting to see long-term effects, long-term, especially safety concerns also, and they should be addressed by following these products for let's say 15 years in a registry. So concluding my contribution would be, yes, we believe that real-world evidence is useful. It will primarily be driven by the question, what do we need to answer? What shall the data add to our understanding? We will look very carefully at the data quality, because that will be very important. We look also at the feasibility. Are the data really there that we need to do our assessments? Is this data on this specific biomarker, this specific endpoint available? And it should be a protocol worked out and preferably registered at one of the sites, like, for instance, NCEP, what we have at the EMA. So transparency is key. And then I think another learning is that we try to get if you use registries, please use one that is existing, not set it up for your own company and collect this data that will then be in isolation, will be very difficult to access for others and to learn for the healthcare system. But as regulators, we have this direct link with the industry, and that makes it sometimes still more easy to go that direction. But as the chair of the task force, this is typically something I would really argue against. So limited experience currently with real-world evidence in sense of licensing change or indication changes, but data becoming stronger, better, and as I think Joe de Kock just presented this, that the digitalization and the opportunities that are coming are so progressing so much faster that I believe that the data will be important, and we need to look at our system, how we can start handling these data better. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and very clearly there, setting that fundamental question. We start with what we want to know, not we've got the data, what do we want to do with it? It'd be interesting to hear later in our discussion what our other panelists think, and setting out some of those challenges as you see it. Let's see as we build this discussion whether others agree with those challenges or identify others. Let me turn now, if I might, to Etienne. Etienne from Novartis. Give us an industry perspective on how it's being used now and how you see its potential for the future. What are the key issues for you, Etienne?
Yeah, many thanks, Jackie, and many thanks for this invitation. This is a great discussion. So I'm in charge of the access of patients in Europe to CAR-T therapy, which is Kymriah at Novartis. And I will give a practical point of view of the post-licensing real-world evidence on CAR-T. So CAR-T, this is an autologous cellular therapy where some of the cells of the immune systems of a cancer patient are harvested and shipped to a manufacturing facility to be re-engineered to fight specific cancer cells, and then are reinfused into the body of the patient. And this innovative approach of treating cancer has led to long-term remissions in deadly forms of pediatrics or adult cancers, and raised new hopes for patients and families. So 2 CAR-Ts have been approved by EMA. It was now more than 2 years ago. And there was a request of setting up a long-term follow-up of CAR-Ts in the real world for monitoring of possible emergent or longer-term adverse events, but also the effectiveness of the drug. And then we had other HTA bodies or payers that have requested real-life efficacy and safety data that will be used either for planned health technology reassessment or for payment model based on outcome, or for confirmation of coverage based on real-world evidence development. And UK, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, or Spain, for instance, are countries where such requests have been reported. So we know that these new cell and gene therapies have been approved with a convincing but somewhat limited data package. And it's great that patients in desperate needs could access quickly despite the remaining uncertainty to these drugs. And I want to say, as a company and even as an industry, we strongly support the setup of such registry to help decisions on earlier access and advance the knowledge in our drugs. So now, 2 years after the approval, where are we? The requests from all these bodies that tend to be essentially similar. I mean, they want baseline patient data, short and long-term safety, information on the follow-up therapies, and short and long-term efficacy outcome. We had also a couple of questions on the resource utilization, but they were marginally requested. And now we end up with one EU registry that we are running with EBMT, the European Bone Marrow Association. We have another one with France, with the local lymphoma cooperative group. We have one with IFA and one in Italy, one with INAMI with Belgium. We have additional data collection that was requested in Switzerland, in Spain, also in the UK. And we see on top of that numerous presentations of single or multi-centers real-world evidence that, outside this registry framework. So definitely we see a suboptimal landscape of real-world evidence. So how to make this real-world collection more efficient? And the first point has been highlighted by the 2 previous speakers. It should take a village to bring a relevant registry to life. We need upfront coordination, upfront collaboration of scientific community, of the patient groups, the regulator, the payers to align on what is a normalized real-world evidence perspective for this specific therapeutic area. And we need flexibility of all the stakeholders here. Second question mark is on the data collection. It's very difficult to have one hospital team filling one registry. If you ask them to fill 2 or 3 registries, then it's mission impossible. And it's not just about financial incentive. It's about prioritization in the everyday care. It's about having people that are able and that have time to fill in this registry. And third, I mean, we see out of the US this data access model from electronic health records. So definitely data access models that facilitate the availability of real-world data with interfacing with electronic health records We need the right data protection standards, but that would be terribly helpful to skip this burdensome manual data collection that we see today. So we see great initiative in Europe to move forward and catching up with other parts of the world. So that was the 3 main points. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, they're adding to that, this question of the upfront collaboration. We'll focus on the learning network, which is all about that later on. But I would be interested to hear from you later in terms of how well that collaboration is working now in this area and what more we could do. But let me turn for some opening remarks to Adrian Jonas. And I should stress, ladies and gentlemen, Adrian is here with us in a personal capacity. And if you're thinking of filling the Q&A box with questions about Brexit and EU-UK relations, unfortunately, he can't answer them. And maybe you can hear from my accent, maybe you'll also spare my pain today by not asking them. So Adrian, a very warm welcome to you. Your opening thoughts in terms of the use of real-world evidence and the challenges as you see them.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So yes, I'm Adrian Jonas, the Associate Director for Data Analytics at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. We have several functions here at NICE, ranging from clinical guidelines to technology appraisals and the safety of interventional procedures. And what I'm doing is leading both an immediate small team and the transformation program to increase the use of real-world data, real-world evidence in the development and evaluation of our guidance, because sometimes we found that there are problems with the evidence. It might be not enough, it might be poor quality, conflicting, or even the wrong sort. And crucially, that's our philosophy here in terms of real-world evidence, real-world data. It shouldn't be a substitute to clinical trials. It should complement and help us fill in the evidence gaps we're left with. And in January this year, we produced a vision or strategy, if you like, called the Statement of Intent to increase and extend the use of data in the development and evaluation of our guidance. You can find this openly on our website. And one of the areas it covers is where, beyond trial data, we already have some examples of using real-world data. For instance, in our economic modelling of a type 2 diabetes guideline, our Parkinson's disease guideline, and we've also, NICE has also, supported a commissioning through evaluation programme that gives selected groups of patients access to promising treatments where trial data isn't yet available or isn't generalisable. So we know that with all this data out there, there are some tremendous opportunities to extrapolate beyond clinical trials, validate immediate outcomes, in time update our guidance more rapidly than we can currently achieve, and thinking of learning health systems, improve tracking of our guidance implementation, uptake, impact, and use this information in turn to inform the need to update. And there are some definite several practical considerations with data analytics though, and real-world evidence. How we handle bias and uncertainty, the access to data, the assessment of its quality, capability, capacity, and recognizing when it's an acceptable or better alternative to traditional trials. So moving forward, we're defining a program to develop a methods and standard framework for further activities across research, governance, data, results and dissemination that will really get into the thick of that and start considering our position further.
Thank you very much indeed. So lots to discuss, but can I just start with one question, a very basic question, Joe, from someone in our audience saying, what is the key differentiator of this initiative on real-world evidence? Is it, says the questioner, the element of learning by doing? Is that the critical part? How do you see it? Because there are many initiatives working on this directly or tangentially to it. What makes this initiative different for you?
Indeed, I think that one of the approaches is, of course, we all know and we repeat each other all the time, okay, there are difficulties with data. But let's see in practice, what are these difficulties? Who are we looking to this data? And therefore, we have set up twice already workshops together with panels from HTA and payer side and the industry on the other side on practical and concrete product initiatives, pilots also, in order to see, okay, what are the questions we are looking for as payer and as HTA? We have this database, what should we improve on it? And I think that indeed learning by doing is one of the elements of a health system as a whole, but especially in these contexts. It's moreover very clear that we should try out and bring together people in order to have the practical answers and knowing each other, understanding about the cautiousness which needs to be respected with regard to that, but nevertheless also to see the opportunities and see, okay, what can we know better when we add some data in this field? What will changing for the payers, what will changing for the patients, what is important to have as information in order to have an evidence-based decision making.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take a few additional comments. As I mentioned earlier, we did ask a few people just to make some brief remarks, a couple of minutes if you would, just with their thoughts and their perspectives to get our discussion started. So let me turn to Dennis Lacombe. Dennis, I have opened your mic. Can you hear me? Can you? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, we can't see you yet, but let me see if I can fix that for you. But please, away you go. So Dennis Lacombe is Director General of the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, and he's co-chair of the Echo Health Systems and Treatment Optimization Network. Dennis, your perspective, please.
Yes, I've just been interrupted. I hope, can you hear me?
Hear you beautifully.
Oh, okay. Okay, so
show you as well, but don't worry.
Okay, so let's try. Yes, so thank you for the invitation first. And actually the organizers have asked me to a little bit go over the work that we have done with the EU Parliament about treatment optimization. And when we created this notion of treatment optimization, which actually was generated by the observation that we have seen many drugs coming to the market, so-called innovative, not necessarily holding up to their promises. As well as diminishing opportunities in Europe to take. Okay, I can start my video. Can you see me now?
If you could, now we can see you. Super.
Okay, good.
Carry on, sir.
So just to carry on, so we have seen the combined observation of, again, drugs, innovative drugs coming to the market, which were not necessarily holding up to their promises, and also diminishing opportunities to take forward actually question how to optimize drugs in the healthcare system, because when a drug is on the market, the work is not finished, it starts. And I'm referring to questions which have been alluded to by Joe, for instance, duration, combination with other drugs, with other modalities. And I will take just an example, which is, for instance, in immuno-oncology, the checkpoint inhibitor and the duration of the treatment, which is a question which we have never properly answered. And it becomes obvious that when drugs have a long-term toxicity and are extremely costly, there would be an interest for the patients to receive shorter treatment, but also for the healthcare system. So the question of treatment optimization, which is extremely patient-centered at the beginning, feeds immediately into the questions about what do we do societally wise when we have all these drugs coming, which we don't know how to use actually. So what we have been proposing through the manifesto, and we are continuing this under the umbrella of the European Cancer Organization, is to look at a reverse, I would say, re-engineer system. Is instead of working from left to right and drug development into a healthcare system, maybe we could also address things from the other angle, from the healthcare system. What are the needs? What are the key clinical questions, and how we are going to answer? And if you allow me an analogy with the sports, I guess that when you play football, you don't play where the ball is or has been, but you want to play where the ball should be, which is in the goal, which is in the healthcare system. So just to finish, because you have given me only 2 to 3 minutes.
Sorry about that.
It's extremely short.
I know.
what do we do with what is the role of real world data in that in that respect? And we have our expertise at the ORTC. Well, we are trying to build our expertise in accessing to real world data. The first issue that we know, of course, is access. Today, it's extremely difficult to access to real world data, and we cannot enter in the details now. Maybe what has been proposed at the European level will solve, but I think what is more crucial, because access we will solve at some point in time, is research on research methodology. How are we going to structure real world data in the continuum from early clinical research, late research, and into access? And I think that's critical. Other speakers have said that clinical trials are, of course, extremely important, but maybe indeed there is a learning curve how we are going to structure all these capacities that we have, whether it's prospective clinical trial, real world data. The last comment I would like to do is about because we cannot speak about real world data without speaking about artificial intelligence. Of course, and I would send at least a sign of caution that for diagnostics, real-world data for diagnostics, for instance, we can build model because it's human-made. Images are human-made. It's relatively easy, if I can say so, to build model. When it comes to cell biology, to cancer biology, it's not human-made. And I think we would be presumptuous to say that we understand this biology and that we are going to predict quite a lot with artificial intelligence. So maybe it is to come, but I think we have to pay attention to the promises we make and progress, of course, stepwise.
Thank you very much, Denis. Thank you so much. Let us now turn to Jan Lecam. Jan, could you please turn on your mic? I have made that possible.
I think
your
it's
mic,
turned on normally.
lovely, and your camera. If we can see you, that would be lovely too. Jan Lecam is Chief Executive Officer at Euroaudis. We have already lots of questions coming in about the role of patient groups in this discussion. So it's great to hear from you, Jan. Over to you, sir. Hello there.
Thank you, Jackie. Hello. Yes, thank you. In fact, what we see from the perspective of rare diseases is that currently there is a certain number of breakthroughs coming in and more in the future, particularly in the field of gene and cell therapies, with many of them having really the potential to be life transforming and in fact life-saving already for some of them. But the issue we have in rare disease is that there is a great deal of uncertainty at the time of market authorization. That has been said, that the package is not obviously sufficient, although as there is no alternative therapy or that is life-changing therapy, obviously patient needs access. And the second uncertainty is on the long-term effect of these therapies. I'd like to insist also that for rare diseases, there is a high heterogeneity of expression of disease across the population of one disease. So we can know about the clinical benefit of a treatment approved only from the moment we collect this real-world evidence post-launch. We cannot know it from the artifact of an artificial homogeneous population for the clinical trial. And that really takes us to the support of real-world evidence as a way to grasp on this heterogeneous population and heterogeneous response to the treatment, but also to have this continuum of data generation that Denis just highlighted. In order to address some of these issues of access and funding of these treatments, we launched 2 years ago the project called Rare Impact, which brings together 16 manufacturers, for-profit or non-profit, together with the company Dolon to support the work, and with FPI, UCOP, and the Alliance of Regenerative Medicines. And together we engage with HTA, with payers, with EMA, with different stakeholders to identify what are the barriers of this access. And one key challenge identified at the European level, which is true across the different member states of Europe, is that the data required for post-approval regulatory differs from the one that payers and HTA are asking for managed entry agreement and other innovative payment methods. So in fact, what is happening is that on the top of the post-marketing efficacy study, safety studies, so the PASS and PASS, of EMA, each HTA agency have their own data generation requirements. And as it was just highlighted by Etienne Joussom also, and this is highly inefficient. So there is no chance, particularly in a small population, when it is 1 in a million patient or 1 in 100,000, that this is a meaningful approach. So for us, there is no consensus today on the collaboration on data collection and on data registry. From a patient advocate perspective, I have to say it's a bit depressing that we can have conversation for 10 years and being unable to take our act together, sorry to say. And it's not only a waste of financial resources and a waste of data, which I would find quite unethical if you think about it, right? It's at the end, it's all patient data, but also it's a waste because it's non-conclusive data collection and request. We cannot, with fragmented HTA and payers request, we cannot optimize the treatment options because this data cannot be consolidated and looked at in a consistent way, exactly like Peter Moll was highlighting. And also we're not making the optimal of the public money allocation. So really for us, the key success factor in real world evidence is the awareness of payers and HTA and the willingness to collaborate and the preparedness to do so in order to provide the alignment which is needed between EMA, HTA and payers in this regard.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. And precisely one of the things this project is doing is raising that awareness and discussing some of those challenges that
absolutely. Excellent.
Let us just one more intervention from the floor. Wim Godesh, I have, you should be able to talk to us now. If you could activate your own... Hello there, sir. Hello. You should be able to activate your camera now. So, there we are. Yes. Wim Godesh is Special Advisor HTA at the Zorg Institute Nederland, ZIN, to give us an HTA perspective. Over to you, and then I'll take some of the questions from the floor. Thank you, Wim.
Thank you, Jackie. Firstly, I would like for inviting me, Joe, and the whole initiative, because I think that we're really struggling, and I think I really support what Jan was saying, to actually bring all these initiatives together. And I think if I talk from an HTA perspective, because I partly work for the National Healthcare Institute, it's really about ensuring better healthcare for the individual patient on one hand, while ensuring long-term sustainability of the healthcare system. And that means for us as an HTA organization that we also say, well, we're moving away from what we call a one-time HTA assessment for pharmaceutical directly after market authorization to a more life cycle approach, which means that we are also going to do more assessments later on and reassessments. And what is already addressed by many of the earlier speakers is that there's a lot of things are going on, many initiatives regarding, well, if we have patient registries, what needs to be the quality of a patient registry? I think, for Janetta did quite a good job on that, actually making the request tool. But also, what kind of study designs do we need if we have a patient registry to actually do a good study, to actually show that the medicine which is new is better than the one which we already used? Then there are all these initiatives which are more focused on, well, if we have all this data, how are we going to collect those? Are we going to put them in one big registry, or do we have a kind of federated data network where we leave them at their own place, but actually find a kind of software tool to collect them? And then finally, what do we do with all this information from wearables, from questionnaires on quality of life? And personally, I've been involved in a few initiatives, which I will quickly want to refer to. I'm currently coordinating from university an Horizon 2020 project called H6, but we say, well, it's not only about real world evidence, because it should be a combination from clinical trial data with real world evidence to get the best prediction. And actually, to bring those data together, we need better methods. And I think we are still in a quite early stage to develop those methods. Another initiative which my organization have been involved is called the IMI Get Real project, which was a kind of project where stakeholders from all places, which including patients, industry, HTA and regulators were involved to see, well, what kind of methods are suitable for all these stakeholders. And finally, I would like to refer to something which we quite recently did as a kind of collaboration between ISPOR, which is Society for Pharmacoeconomics, and ISPI for Pharmacoepi, where we said, well, the first starting point of all these studies would be transparency. So if we are going to do studies with real world data, what are we going to make the public? Are we going to have something like clinicaltrial.gov for these type of studies? And I think NCIP already is doing a little bit like that for which use real world data for safety. And also in the Netherlands, we are currently doing work on monitoring new pharmaceuticals using patient registries. And my big worry is, and I think Jan already very clearly indicated, that there are so many initiatives on a national level, on the international level, while it's still not enough coordination. This initiative do, and what can the European Union do to actually facilitate that these initiatives come together, and actually if we find a way to use that money which is already invested in it, just as John said, in really methods and outcomes which will be used by HCA, by regulators, by payers, but also by patients and clinicians.
Thank you very much indeed, Wim. Thank you. Okay, so lots of comments there, lots of challenges raised. And maybe, Joe, just to pick up on that point, and the rest of you that Wim was making, this struggle to bring these initiatives together. Why do you think it is difficult to do that? And how do you see the way forward? We're going to talk later about the potential role of a learning network in doing that. But what for you is the key now? And on this issue, I've been very struck how many people have repeated, we have to start with what is it we need to answer, not with where's the data. So you start with the question and then see where the real world data and evidence can help to, so that's one of the circumstances it could be used. Your reaction on both those, if you would, and the same to all of you.
Yes, there are indeed a lot of initiatives going on, and I think the challenge is to bring them together and to integrate them in something which is visible. And I think we have the possibility now to do so when two European strategies are coming together, the data one and the pharmaceutical policy one. The question is, of course, also the decision making in the European context, which is not an easy one, but nevertheless, these voluntary mechanisms to work together and to reach goals, I think they are possible. I refer to an initiative which was taken recently by different countries. It's the Horizon Scanning Project, in which we have put together, I think, 16 member states for the moment, also outside Europe. Canada is working with us to see, okay, how can we, from the beginning point, be creating sufficient awareness in order to prepare a kind of decision making which is based on the right research questions and the right questions. There are initiatives already. The question is, okay, how can we make this initiative sufficiently sustainable and not only pilots? We have a lot of pilots, but we have not sufficient airports to bring together all this aircrafts. We have to make, I think, what someone has said, bring together this fragmented landscape and try to join forces and not to launch different initiatives. It's a piece of puzzle in which, of course, a network we propose is one element of a more broader pictures. We should bring together, but on a continuous way, not in pilots or actions which are limited in time. This is an endeavor and should be a key element of health systems and decision making in new technologies.
Can I ask, and Adrian, perhaps come to you first, in terms of the barrier, we're hearing from a lot of our speakers, a lot of the perspectives, a frustration with the scale of progress and how difficult it is and to overcome these issues of fragmentation and so on. What do you think is the key barrier? You identified some of the challenges and issues we need to address. What is holding back progress and what does that mean for the future, do you think? Same question to you, to Etienne and Peter. What's the key barrier, the key challenge? To Adrian, please.
I think it's also...
Hang on, Joe. Hang on. This one I've asked to Adrian.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, Joe, but I think where everyone else can jump in, Jackie, is I don't think there is one single issue here. We're talking about a whole ecosystem that needs to continually evolve, and we're talking about data quality, data access on one hand, as I touched on, but then it's only once those mature and we have standards in place around those that I think you'll get greater cultural acceptance. I mean, Jan touched on it, but underpinning all of this is collaboration and public trust, and that's where I think we wouldn't want to lose efforts at this point and trying to coalesce various initiatives. There will be a danger that we suddenly become paralysed. For instance, I didn't touch on that our science policy and research team are heavily involved in NICE, so the IMI Get Real initiative, and then the EDEN, the European Health Data and Evidence Network, which is, and again, that's looking at developing federated data networks using common data models, and it's all learning that can be fed back into this huge change management journey we're going through.
Thank you very much. Same question to you both. And could I just say to Flora in the audience, you've put an interesting comment, but it's in the chat box. Could you perhaps copy and paste it and put it into the Q&A box so that everyone can see it? But Etienne, from your perspective, in terms of, as Adrian was saying, and Joe has made clear, multiple issues to address, but what for you is the key thing holding back progress under the conditions we've talked about, in the circumstances we've talked about, really making the best possible use of real world evidence? What's holding us back? Your mic is off. Could you
Thank you.
Thanks.
I agree with everything that was previously said. And I may focus my answer specifically on the health technology assessment and bodies. And we see today that some health technology assessment bodies, they accept the real world evidence, and some they don't even open the file when we're bringing real world evidence to support our file. So I mean, definitely there are cultural differences in the way we assess the drug in each of the countries, but coordinated work at the United HTA level on that topic will be very helpful. So we have GBA, for instance, that has issued very recently guidelines on how to analyze real world evidence and under what condition analysis on real world evidence will be accepted by the GBA and possibly changing the benefit assessment. I think it's a good step forward, but we need such work coordinated at the United HTA level, not only at the GBA or HAS or NICE or other or INAMI or ZIN or other technology assessment bodies. And coordination would be key here to advance the predictability of the predictability of the outcome that the analysis we're bringing.
We can talk later about whether that EU learning network that Joe has mentioned, that we're going to discuss in our next panel, how it can help to address that. Peter, for you, the key challenge, the key barrier that is holding us back from answering some of these issues you've all raised and really making progress here.
So as many said, it's obviously multifactorial. But if I want to pick a different aspect that is really key also to the regulator is the quality of the data in the end. Do we really have a sufficient understanding of the robustness of the data? So the not just the outcomes as they are presented or available from the data, but also the way we analyze it, because we are really looking at causality of a drug effect, and we want to understand, does this drug cause this outcome? And yeah, the corner is the randomized controlled trial. And I think Michael Amish made that comment also, and I answered that in writing, that I believe this is still where we come from. We want to have this causal evaluation of the drug effect. And for that, the randomization is such a key part that it will be important. Having a way forward is indeed that we get these better data available, that we might even capture the outcomes that may not be the clinical, the more specific ones, but the longer term, the mortality kind of things, that we can capture the patient report outcomes. So the contribution of the patient is really important. So engaging them is also, I think, an important point. But yeah, quality of the data and the randomization in a data set. And again, I think IMI Get Real was mentioned a couple of times. They have proposed things like also the randomized registry-based trials. You could imagine that these are developments that are very promising and would bring, I think, a lot of also to the regulator. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's take a couple of questions from the floor. I see a hand up, but let me take a written one first because he posted it almost as soon as we started. Thomas Bowles says, isn't the question more what real-world data will support pricing and reimbursement decisions instead of how it will support decisions? Are we, Joe, putting too much emphasis on the how and not enough on the what? And I think I would link that to all the comments about what do we want it for? Which answers our question of what real-world data. Do we need to focus on the how before we focus on the what? Joe, your mic is off. If you could just...
Yes, I have unmuted myself. Okay, this question are interlinked, of course. What real-world data we want and how. The two are interlinked as the question is the two they are the questions of the scientific and the robustness of the data, and how can we have sufficient information which allows us to make evidence-based decisions on the one hand, but on the other hand, the question is here taking into account that these questions are always coming forward with in smaller patients group in which randomized clinical trials not always are available. Is it the way, how can we then make these decisions nevertheless that we know that we have no alternative, and can we do that on the best way? Does the two are interlinked, I think, and especially when we are looking to this small patient groups, as Jan Lekam has mentioned, for rare diseases. I think that's an important issue to clarify as soon as possible, which data are needed, but also how can we bring this in a reality? And it's for me, they are interlinked. It are two different elements of a same question.
Thank you. And there's a question about the role of the patient in all of this. Yep. Somebody saying, why is the network, we don't have the network yet, but we have the initiative, not owned by the patients? They provide the information and benefit the most from the results. Public organisations are led by politicians with a scope of 4 years until the next elections, or, says the questioner, by civil servants without a will of their own. So this question of the role of the patient and putting the patient at the heart of all of this. Can anyone pick up on that question? Maybe it is one for you, Joe, as you were leading the...
No, of course, the patients have an important role to play. It was already mentioned, the quality of life, patient-related outcome measurement, and so on. These are important issues. The question is, of course, creating a learning network or a platform of how you call it. It should be organized, and it should have sufficient administrative support to have the links between all the stakeholders involved. It's not a political instrument, of course. For instance, the cooperation between member states we see, and in a lot of member states in Europe, they are also based on cooperation between institutions, and it's our mission, of course, to make the proposals, at least for clear decision making and evidence decision making involving everyone who can play a role in that.
Thank you. Anybody want to add anything on that before I go to the floor?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the openness of the platform is critical. It can belong to the patient groups, this real-world evidence. In some cases, it's owned by an academic institution, a hospital, on behalf of a scientific group or scientific cooperative group. I'm not aware of registries that are owned really by the administration. No. Maybe they are. So there may be a misunderstanding here, but what is key, I mean, whether it's owned by the patient, whether it's owned by an academic institution, or whether it's sponsored by a company, that it remains open, right? And we have all these stakeholders being able to discuss with the owner, build analysis on it, and publish. And I think this is a critical thing.
Thank you. There's a comment here from someone. Isn't it more complicated than patient-driven? A lot of health data is about citizens and patients, not generated by patients per se. Hence, it's about overall responsibility outside of ownership. I'll leave that more as a comment. Let me go to the floor, and I'm going to open the mic of Chris Sotirelis. Chris, your mic, if you have a, there we go. Away you go, sir.
Hello, thank you very much, Jackie. Hello, everybody. Just to introduce myself very quickly, I am the patient, and I'm here as the patient, and I have been directly involved with the initiative under the leadership of Joe de Kock. And I am very happy to be involved because as a patient advocate with a long experience in rare diseases, one of which I have myself, I am very interested to try to see how this initiative can actually bridge the gap between clinical efficacy and safety and clinical effectiveness and relative effectiveness and safety. And this is a gap that has been increasing remarkably fast in the last several years. And particularly in the field of rare diseases, and more specifically in the field of ATMPs. So I would like to share some of my perspective and very quick summary of
if you could briefly, Chris, because we're nearly out of time in this.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. So, in fact, for me, I mean, all of the details and the issues and the aspects mentioned already by the panelists and the commentators are very important. But actually, the elephant in the room is what is the legal status of registries? What is the position of the governance under which this real world evidence will be collected? And this has many issues and has many knock-on effect in other areas, but it is important also to have registries which are disease-based registries, also reflecting on the comments made about the heterogeneity of rare disease patient population. It's important to have the registries being matched and very closely focused to the flexibility, and have flexibility for that heterogeneous population through some kind of method of stratification or pulling together different types of subtypes within a particular disease. The other issue is the other issue is, particularly with the legal status, is that we know that in several member states, observational studies are not valid and are not possible to be basically to lead to anywhere. And finally, within that legal framework that is needed to be created, and I think perhaps this initiative could take part in actually developing this, is what is the position of the patient and where is that patient? Because we were discussing about patients give their data, but then it feels more that the interaction of patients finishes at the end when they sign the consent agreement. So we want more of that, and we want a co-creation framework with patients at the center.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And we're going to talk more about that co-creation framework when we in our next session. I don't know whether anyone has a 1-minute reply they can give or a comment on the legal issues that Chris is raising. Can anybody help us with that? Not particularly so. No, we'll leave that on the table. It was more comment than question. I'm going to ask now to try and identify the way forward. There is one question. Jan de Kam has come back in with a question to Andre Riche. I should say Andre is not part of this panel, Jan, but I'll read it out. We're going to hear from Jan at the end, from Andre at the end of the day. So we'll see whether he wants to take it up there. Is the European Commission ready to support and incentivize collaboration between member states, regulators, HTA payers, to agree on common research questions and common evidence generation plan. This is our
Yes.
understanding of the EU Pharma Strategy Roadmap. I will leave that for now. And if Andre wants to pick up on that, because he's going to talk about the way forward later, I will leave that to him. As I say, he's not part of this panel. But you are, gentlemen, and I would just like, by way of conclusion, to try and identify where we go from here. As I say, one of the things we're going to talk about in the next session is this learning network. And how do we make sure that you get that collaboration, that transparency Joe talked about, and that you really contribute to a learning healthcare system. But for each of you, if I asked you to identify one priority, and I'll go in reverse order to the way I gave you the floor at the beginning, or one key next step. I mean, we've identified multiple challenges, but a key next step now to build on the work that's been done by this initiative and all the other initiatives that you've mentioned, and really break through that barrier, some of that frustration we've been hearing from some of you and from our interveners from the floor. What for each of you would be your key next steps? I'm going to go Adrian, Etienne, Peter, and give Joe the last word. Adrian, what's the key next step for you, or the top priority?
So the top priority for me and NICE is developing a clear, transparent standards and methods program that will be delivered as a suite of products over the next couple of years. But my one word would still be collaboration. Disease doesn't have geographic boundaries, therefore collaboration across various initiatives is going to continue to be key as we all develop our own initiatives further.
Thank you very much. Etienne.
Yeah, I mean, I would love that the priority that Adrian described at the NICE to develop ad hoc methods to analyze real-world evidence would be picked up in other countries, definitely. But I think the opportunities that we have to analyze without manual data collection, large databases, is something critical, and we need to have the framework with the adequate data privacy and the adequate access for many stakeholders, adequate transparency of usage to help inform decision making. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Yeah, obviously agree again with many of the comments, but my key step would be to come with examples. We will need to understand, to have a case-by-case understanding of what you can do with real-world data and how it can support our decision making. So I would like to see people coming through with examples of good data sources, fair collection of information, and as representative as possible of the population that we have in Europe, but understanding that there are limitations as there are in clinical trials. But please come forward with examples.
Thank you very much. Joe.
Okay, that's what we are doing, learning by doing. It's finding the good examples, but my priority would be, I'm not a scientist, but as a policymaker, of course, my priority should be to bundle forces and get a structure which is sufficiently stable with a good and transparent governance. That's the ultimate goal. That will need different steps before we arrive there. Flora, Giorgio already mentioned in the chat that there are possibilities. We know all Article 15 of the cross-border directive she is referring to, and it's operationalize this issue. And as Wim Gutsch said, okay, HTA 2.0 is something which you have to bring on board. It's not a one-shot HTA, but it's something which is a continuous endeavor. And also, and it's mostly not bring on board, but is for the public all to clarify why we take some decisions in one side and then others in another side. And this transparency also in decision making is clearly needed.
Thank you very much. And let me just refer to a couple of comments that have come in before we close. You mentioned the one from Flora Giorgio talking about looking to the future. We could see a possible future framework, EU framework for HTA, could actually provide the medium long-term forum to implement a life cycle approach that several of you have referred to. The proposal could provide that framework to channel the results of current ongoing initiatives, and it foresees structured cooperation between EMA and HTA bodies, pre-launch, at launch, and possibly post-launch. So it could provide the framework. So that's one comment. Also another one from Denis Lacombe about the what and the how. There are situations where we can only do simple collections, others where we can run trials. The what drives the how. Randomization is not an issue. We should be able to randomize in real life when needed to bring robust evidence to patients. The eligibility criteria are the problem when too restrictive, especially in regular trials. And one last one. A first step, says Frank Hulstart, could be to include in pivotal trials an active comparator acceptable for payers so that the follow-up of randomized trial patients can be for longer periods as real-world data, so payer-relevant endpoints become available without the need for too early crossover. Thank you for all those comments. Thank you for your inputs. I think I got to almost everybody, or some of you were replied to by our wonderful speakers online. They've been multitasking as we speak. So thank you very much. And Joe, thank you for your opening presentation. Thank you to the rest of you for a great discussion and your contributions. We are going to take a short break, but please don't log off. Stay online, and we will be back. So I suggest you mute yourself if you're going to go and make a cup of tea or whatever it is you might choose to do in the next 15 minutes. Maybe turn off your camera. And I will see you back here in 15 minutes, or 14 minutes now, at 3:45, when we are going to focus on this question of the co-creation, that word we have heard time and again this afternoon, of a multi-stakeholder EU learning network on real-world evidence. So we'll have another short presentation about the work that's been done by the initiative and another interactive discussion. Gentlemen, the audience can't thank you, so let me do the thanking for them, for your great contributions. Do stay, and if you want to make a comment or join in with the discussion later on, very happy to hear from you again. But we're going to take that break now, as I say, back at 3:45, and don't log off, just mute yourself, and I'll see you shortly. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So, welcome back to this second session of our conference today. In our first panel, we discussed the potential role of real-world evidence, what gaps it can fill, and in what circumstances does it have a role to play. We also identified some of the key barriers and some of the challenges that need to be addressed in order to realize its potential to inform HTA and payer decisions, and to deliver, crucially, at the end of all of this, of course, the ultimate objective, delivering better outcomes for patients. Our speakers in the first panel all underlined the importance of collaboration and co-creation with different stakeholders to address these issues, to try to agree what real-world data to collect, when, where, and by whom, in order to generate that real-world evidence. We're going to focus on that co-creation element in our second panel, which is entitled How to Realize a Learning Healthcare System. And we're going to, this initiative, as you heard from Joe earlier, proposed the co-creation of a multi-stakeholder EU learning network on real-world evidence. We're going to hear about that proposal, what was envisaged, and then we're going to discuss some of the potential features of that network and where we would need to go from here in order to realize it. And then we will end the day with some closing thoughts from Joe de Croc and from Andre Rich. So I'm delighted to welcome first, as before, we're going to have a context setting presentation, and then I will introduce the rest of our panelists after that. But I'm delighted to welcome Karen Facey. Karen is Senior Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and lead co-author of the RWE for Decisions Actions for Stakeholders. So Karen's going to take us through, as I say, the proposals for networking, and then we will discuss this. Karen, a very warm welcome to you, and over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jackie. I'm having my own technical difficulties today, so I need you to tell me if I need to revert to the phone. So apologies if I have any glitches. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about real-world evidence division for decisions and how it was enacted, to think about how that can input to a learning healthcare system and a learning network. So let's first reflect on the learning healthcare system itself. It's a concept that's been around actually for a decade or more, and at the heart of it has been how we can use developments in digitization of healthcare, as we heard Andre talk about at the beginning, to improve our health systems. And there's a recognition within the learning health system construct that this is a continuously learning process. I'm a statistician by training, and when I came into the health system, we did great big audits of all sorts of things. They were very outdated. The data was about 6 months old by the time we got it, and by the time we made the change to the health system a couple of years later, everything was out of date. So we need to do things differently. I went to Scotland 20 years ago to lead the HTA agency there, and I was really excited. It's quite a small population, but some great data. Since the 1960s, we've had a unique patient identifier for every patient in Scotland. We collect lots of data. And so I was pretty dismayed by when we had to come to make difficult decisions about whether to invest in a new technology and whether it was real value for money. I thought, well, we can use our data to help us answer that question. Actually, we can't link the data up as easily as I thought we could. We can't answer key questions that we need to use that data to improve our health systems and get better outcomes for patients. So we've got all this data, but how do we actually use it? What are the questions we can use it for, as we've been hearing earlier? I've been very influenced by what the Institute for Healthcare Improvement has done in the US, thinking about continuous learning and continuous improvement. And at the heart of that are the plan, do, study, act cycles. Plan means we don't just do something on our own. We look for the very best evidence to find out what might work. We then trial it in our own situation. We do it. We then reflect on what has happened within that small situation, and then we act, and we keep going around in those cycles. And in patient safety programs, which many countries have instigated, we've seen real change in this situation where we try something in a small level and we grow it and we really make change across a whole health system. And we know health systems are complex, but I've seen this really work. So I came in to the initiative because I'm in a research project looking at appraisal of treatments for rare diseases. And at the time, at the end of 1999, we were seeing some really exciting, innovative technologies coming through, particularly for the field of rare diseases. And we were hearing words we don't often hear with new medicines, which were they are curative, they are really transformative. These are really stopping disease progressions in their tracks. They are curing cancer. We are doing things we never dreamed we could. So that's really exciting, and a lot of people want access to those treatments. But from a payer point of view, these come at quite a cost. They're complex interventions. So we have a difficult decision to make to determine their value. There is a complex delivery, as Etienne was describing with the CAR T-cell therapies. But we also need to think about, we've got limited resources. We need to use those resources most wisely. Who do we treat? And for some treatments, how long do we treat? And when we see a clinical trial, as Jan was talking about, that's in a very controlled population. How does that feature in our own health system? And we actually need some long-term outcomes, because if you're saying it's curative, we need to demonstrate that it really is a cure over longer term. And as I said, what we're seeing is a lot of these technologies coming through in the rare diseases and what I would call the ultra rare diseases. A study last year showed that although we have over about 6,500 rare diseases, actually about 5,000 of them are what we would call ultra rare. They occur in less than 1 in a million in our population, which means we have incredibly small populations on which to do not only clinical studies, but also this real world data collection. So that's why I'm passionate about getting people together to identify how we can gather the best possible data to answer the key questions we have about the value of a technology, but do it collaboratively. And of course, I have a vested interest in this because I'm like Norway and Sweden and Finland and all those other small countries. We couldn't do this on our own. So I got involved in the work that Jo was doing with FIPRA in Belgium, and I love multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I was there as an academic, and we were working with clinicians and patient groups, registry holders, payer HTA bodies, regulators, and the pharmaceutical industry. And later we got involved with so-called real-world development analytics groups. And we all worked together to say, okay, what can we actually do? Let's stop talking about it. What are the real actions we can take? So I'm the academic, so I published a paper, but that's not really the interesting thing. You can go away and read that, and you can see our 2 pages of actions that we developed for the different stakeholders. And here's an example of one set of actions. Here's the actions that, in a sense, I gave back to Jo. So these are the actions for the multi-country HTA or payer collaboratives. And there's a couple of pages of these. But, you know, Jo's great. You've all seen him. He says, okay, you've heard him say it. We need to learn by doing. It's no good having these actions in a paper. What's the good of that? What's the good of an academic paper? So he said, let's try and trial this. A key concept here, as everybody has been talking about, is we need to be clear what we want real world data to answer. So we need to be clear about the questions, but we're not actually very clear about the questions. So he said, let's have a workshop. Let's bring all the stakeholders together. Let's talk about some real products that are not yet at the stage of regulatory authorization. And let's see if we can together identify the most important uncertainties and what real world data might be used to resolve those uncertainties. So just 10 days ago, we had a workshop, and I would call it in IT terms, a sort of demonstration project. And it involved a patient expert, registry holders, payers and HTA bodies, clinicians, and the pharmaceutical industry. It didn't include regulators or the real world evidence groups. And there were some challenges there about how we could include regulators. And what I'd like to reflect on is, in a sense, what some of the challenges are that we may need to be upfront about. So we had a workshop 10 days ago, and we discussed 3 real products, pharmaceutical companies came in a confidential way, and we discussed their products and what they were proposing to do in terms of real world evidence generation. So we ran a case study workshop, and that enabled us to recognize we could have these multi-stakeholder dialogues about quite sensitive issues. It was a joint process with several regulators, really important to include the European reference networks. As Andre was saying, they're all tasked with generating registries, but are they generating registries that meet the needs of HTA and payers? We're not quite so sure. So it's good to have these discussions. And then if we look at the actions that we had proposed for industry, we were clear that they need to think about generation of real world data over the life cycle. And like others earlier in the discussion, we were clear that we want to know your plans. We want to understand how that's been planned, what the statistical analysis plans, and we push for transparency around that. So sharing these in something like the NSET portal or elsewhere. And we are also interested in where that data is going to come from. Is it just going to be US, or where are you going to get your European data collection? So having done that experience just 10 days ago, we'll be writing up some general learnings for that, because we'd like to put that into a learning network. But we've reflected back on our paper. As Yo said, two key principles are important to us: transparency and collaboration. So we said 4 things about transparency that we needed to consider. And by doing the workshop, we've been able to reflect further on those. So of course, we said that we need to manage conflicts of interest, and we need to be upfront about the conflicts of interest. But we found in our process, which we tried to make light touch, so a very small template to address the questions, that there were challenges in dealing with the conflicts of interest. And even though it was a light touch process, we had to have watertight governance for that. And another word that keeps coming back is governance, and how we dress governance in this. So how do we make processes manageable and feasible in terms of the limited time we will have, but with good governance? We also identified this issue that within transparency, we need to be clear about what's important. And within that, the dialogue is important. So as HTA and payers, we could create a long list of questions we'd like answered, but actually we need to hone those down to what are the most critical ones, so that we can make a decision about value. Then we need to listen when the industry say, well, actually, yes, that's all well and fine, but we got 10 different requirements from 10 different bodies, and they were all slightly different. So we need to be clear about the areas where we can agree, and the areas where there are divergence, where perhaps we need a little more work. And just as I come to my wrap up, just thinking about the other element of what we see as being crucial is this area around collaboration. If we unpack that a little bit, we did a process whereby we looked specifically at highly innovative technologies. We tried to bring all stakeholders together. When we reflected at the end, we did think, how does this overlap with UNETA, with what parallel dialogues are happening between EMA and HTA? And we were identifying that we were doing something that was really payer-led, that was a higher level. We knew that UNETA's doing great work, EMA's doing great work on the methodology, but different people can work at different levels. So how do we make that clear? And how do we make it clear what we should be talking about at what point in the life cycle of a technology? And finally, I think coming back in terms of collaboration, for me, I had this analogy, which was we absolutely need to think about an onion of core data. There is a central part of the onion, which I think we should all be able to agree on, the sort of 1 or 2 key outcomes that should be collected to answer every decision maker's questions. And then maybe HTA bodies have a sort of different layer to regulators, and then countries maybe have their own specifications. But if we can identify that key core and really come to some way in which we can agree what that is and ensure data collection across countries and across decision makers, that would be great. And of course, the final element we put in the paper about collaboration was that we each need to take our own responsibility and not just say it's the patient's responsibility or it's the ERN's responsibility. We need to find some way of bringing this all together. And we know only too well that there are many other initiatives, many of which we've already talked about and we've heard from already, and more which we'll see. But we really want to think about this learning network, because these are questions I hope we're going to discuss in the next hour or so. We think the learning network needs to have open governance, and for it, really importantly, reciprocity and involvement of all stakeholders. And that's one of the challenges we see with some of the other networks, that we don't see all stakeholders involved and everybody taking ownership for their own element. So we need, within that, open knowledge sharing and dialogue. We need to develop actions and goals, and people may be doing different things, because we have methodological experts and we have people who are experts in the kind of patient involvement side. And to do that, as Yo said, we think this learning network needs to be owned by a public institution, enable full multi-stakeholder interaction, and be sustainable through long-term funding. And at that point, I'm going to hand back to you, Jackie, to hear what everybody else has got to say.
Very much, Karen. That was terrific and a great whistle-stop tour in the very limited time available, and your technology held up beautifully. So you're probably very relieved. So that crucial question, can we create this learning network? And if we can, how do you ensure, as you were saying, that reciprocity, that involvement, and make sure that everyone takes their responsibility and it really, really does deliver? You've identified what you think are some key characteristics this network needs to have if it is to work. Let's hear from our other speakers. And let me introduce them. And I see their mics are already going on, which is terrific. Joining Karen and I to discuss this, we have Peter Arlett, who is head of the Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at the European Medicines Agency and co-chair of the EMA-HMA Big Data Task Force. We have Pia Rananheimo. I hope I pronounced your name, Pia, not too horribly.
That was perfect, thank you.
A pharmaco-economist at the Finnish Medicines Agency, Fimea, and one of the co-authors of the Real World Evidence for Decisions paper. And last but very much not least, we are delighted to welcome Jakub Boraczynski, Acting Director in charge of Digital Society, Trust and Cybersecurity in DG Connect in the European Commission. We've again, as with the last panel, asked the rest of our speakers to make some opening remarks of just 3 to 4 minutes each, and then I will have some questions for them, and I will also put their questions to you. Just a reminder, Q&A button if you want to write your question, put your hand up if you'd like to speak your question, and I will give as many of you the floor as possible. We have, as in the first panel, identified a few people just to get our discussion started who we'd like to hear from the floor, but please do join in. So let's start with Peter. Peter, your perspectives. Karen's outlined there what this learning network is needed for and some of the principles she thinks need to underlie it. Your thoughts, please. Peter, can you hear us? We seem to be having a little bit of an issue with Peter. So while that is happening, let me turn instead to Pia, and then I'll come back to Peter in a little while, because we seem to have just lost him just as we started there. So Pia, your thoughts, if you would, please.
Thank you, Jackie. And I just want to start by saying that it's such a great inspiration to work with Karen. It's been a good experience with this initiative, and I think we've accomplished a nice paper that sort of gives framework for discussions further. So I work at the Finnish Medicines Agency as a pharmacoeconomist, and among other things, I author HTA reports and do both clinical and economic reviews in my work. And we assess new medicines that are used in hospital settings, so this innovative immuno-oncology and orphan diseases and so on. That's really relevant scope for our work. So today I thought I would sort of try to speak from an HTA author perspective, and I think it's relevant to say that our HTA team is a partner in EUNETA and also in FINOSE collaboration, and FINOSE is sort of a Nordic HTA collaboration that involves Fimea and NOMA from Norway and TLV from Sweden. So our work, our HTA work at FIMA involves a lot of collaboration with European HTA organizations. And I think it's very visible that different organizations are integrating the use of real-world data in their work at a very different pace. And also our mandates related to managed entry agreements, post-launch evidence generations, reassessment, scientific advice, etc., differ, especially in this hospital setting where many of these medicines and new treatments are targeted. So it's very important to notice when we talk about learning network that the role a HTA organization can take in the use of real-world data can differ in different countries. So, sort of that's one note that I would like to make at this point. And while I was listening the other panelists previously, I was thinking that maybe we need a network of networks or an implementation network instead of a learning network, because we know that many great initiatives have been done and are ongoing. And we sort of, most of us are involved in some or few of them. But I think it's also important to say that we need a super talented team for network coordination and facilitation, because it's such a complex sort of ecosystem. And it's a real risk that organizations don't commit to a yet another initiative or network.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I will continue later.
Oh, sure. If you wanted to make an additional point, you have 1 minute left.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, it's been stated before that there's sort of benefits that we could achieve in multiple levels, not only related to sort of individual HTA assessment. So I see a lot of potential in a learning network related to also like policy learnings, methodological learnings, etc. So I think it's important to state that multiple levels can be considered here.
So maybe widening its remit somewhat from simply the sharing in this way. Thank you so much, Pia, identifying, and I was intrigued by your point about an implementation network. Maybe we'll come back to that in our discussion. But Peter, I think you're back with us, and I think your mic should be working.
Can you hear me?
Thank you very much for the
So predictably, just at the moment that the session was starting, the internet link went down, but I'm back with you. I'm pleased to be here for this important discussion. Really interesting perspectives in the first session, and I want to maybe complement them. I think the first thing to say is that real-world evidence isn't about the future, it's about the here and now. And right now, as a medicines regulator, we recognize that the clinical trial remains king or queen, depending on your perspective, but real-world evidence is definitely there to complement, fill the gaps, and answer certain questions that clinical trials can't do. It's critical to plan early, and as many people have said, ideally a plan for drug development will meet the needs of the different stakeholders. So regulator, HTA, payer, and ultimately healthcare professionals and patients. And I guess the learnings initiative could either be regarded from a product specific basis, or it could be regarded from a systems basis. And maybe that's something that will come out in the discussion. So are we talking about a forum to discuss guidelines, or for example, or data quality framework, or are we talking about a forum to discuss individual products, which are clearly complementary initiatives? Use cases have been mentioned a lot. In medicines regulation, disease epidemiology, context for clinical trials, safety, risk management, special populations are all areas where real-world evidence has got a very well-established use case and methodology is established. Efficacy or effectiveness, depending on the terminology you use, is the tricky one, and the area where we need most methodologies work to establish the place where real-world evidence can be used. The other area I would just mention, given COVID, is that we believe that real-world evidence has an important part to play in crisis planning and crisis response, including work on shortages, on repurposing medicines, and of course on monitoring therapeutics and vaccines. So let's not forget that at this current time. We are doing an awful lot of work as regulators, but also with multiple stakeholders to improve the framework and improve the evidentiary value of real-world evidence. Andre Riche made reference to the Big Data Task Force and its final report published in January this year, which focuses on accessing data, quality of data, methods, transparency, training, data protection, as Chris, the patient representative, referred to earlier. They referred to the elephant in the room. If we're talking about data protection, I think we should go and give that elephant a big hug, because just having an elephant in the room isn't the answer. We need to embrace the complexity, cut through the complexity, fully comply with legislation, and EMA is working on a question and answer document in consultation with patients and healthcare professionals to try and help navigate the complexity of data protection. A couple of quick points. The flagship of our work going forward, if we get funding, will be the so-called Darwin EU project, Data Analytics and Real World Interrogation Network. And we believe this will bring major benefits across the spectrum of stakeholders. And if that flies, and we're hoping it will start to fly in 2021, we will want to embrace payers, HTA, patients, etc. I think one of the key messages is that we can achieve more together, both across stakeholder groups within the European Union, but also reaching out to other regions of the world. And we were very pleased to be able to announce last June that we're working with the US Food and Drug Administration on a roadmap for international collaboration in the area of real-world evidence. Nearly done, Jackie. We believe that real-world evidence can support product development for patients. We believe that real-world evidence can support safe and effective use of products on the market for patients. And we think that in all the work we do, it should be for patients and with patients. And it's not just a throwaway remark, it's very much the central theme of this conference today. We are convinced and committed that we will achieve more together. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, and lots to come back to in our discussion. Very interesting you raised for the first time today the impact of COVID, and obviously a situation where real world evidence has been the only evidence we had at the very start. Whether that's changed thinking, whether you be interested to hear what the other panelists feel about the impact it's had, and that fascinating question about, are we talking about the systems or are we talking about the actual products? What would this network exist to do? I'll come back for Karen's thoughts and Piers and the others later. But I'm now going to turn to Jakub. Is it Jakub or is it Kuba? I see your name comes up on the screen as Kuba. Your mic is off. Can you just activate your mic, please?
Yes, good afternoon. Yes. Thank you very much, Jackie, for introduction. I'm both Kuba and Jakub. Yes, Kuba is the nickname broadly used, yes. Well, so shall I start?
Yes, please.
Excellent. So again, thanks a lot for the invitation. Excellent opportunity to actually, for me to learn about this initiative. Yes, COVID was mentioned. No doubt it has been a major catalyst for realizing that unthinkable is thinkable, that we can actually do things that we have been thinking about for many, many years, but progress has been very difficult. I think now, indeed, this scene is open, and I have a pleasure and honor to represent DigiConnect, which is very part of the Commission, which is responsible for digital innovation, among others, and for the digital dimension of Commission's work. And it is indeed digital innovation in the sphere of health is something where we can indeed make the difference. We have seen through the wide portfolio of research projects supported by Horizon that we could see how, what type of amazing transformations are possible through the use of digital technologies, notably AI or digital twins, leading to personalized medicine. And indeed, in all of this, we clearly need large volumes of data, and so that we can train artificial intelligence. And we have been actually working very closely with colleagues from across the Commission, notably with DG Sante. You had the pleasure to listen to Andre Riche today, how we can actually make different kinds of health data accessible, I would say securely accessible in respect of European values for research and innovation purposes. You know, we have different dimensions of that. So we have a personal electronic health records, but we have also genomic data, we have cancer images, and again, you know, just to refer also to the presentation, you know, where it could make a lot of difference is also the research into rare diseases. If you think about conditions, how all of this could work, of course, for us it is essential, and this is, you know, one of the typical things we do in Europe. You know, we need to make sure that our actions are interoperable. And of course, if you think about European electronic health records, that exchange is of critical nature. What we need definitely is, you know, to have a right technical specification so that, you know, at the end, you know, we could have those electronic health record exchanges, you know, covering, you know, lab tests, hospital discharge reports, medical images, etc. Just one specific example where, you know, let's say support can contribute. In February of this year, Commissioner Breton has unveiled, you know, the new data strategy for the Union. And I think, you know, it covers, of course, a lot of things. There was a strong focus on industrial data, but clearly health data is one of the critical areas where we would like to actually, you know, really make a decisive step forward by, you know, working on a legislative framework for health data sharing that, you know, as I mentioned before, would reflect our values, but again, part of let's say, of the hat that I'm wearing, where we also, for example, ensure the high level of cybersecurity. When we look, by the way, into implementation of cybersecurity measures across Europe, it is in the health sector that there is really a major need for investment, and there, you know, and many health establishments are potentially quite vulnerable. Now, we will be supporting these initiatives with the Digital Europe program to deploy, you know, the infrastructures that would underpin these common data spaces, and notably, you know, the one in the area of health. It would be indeed this European health data space. I'm sure that Andrzej mentioned this in the earlier session. It is indeed essential for making ultimately informed evidence-based or real-world evidence-based decision in order to improve accessibility, effectiveness, and sustainability of healthcare system. And I think it is essential that indeed we make a great effort to make the data accessible to researchers and innovators, and also that we do not lose the trust of citizens in the process. So I suggest I stop here, and looking forward to continuation of the debate. I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
No, sorry, I failed to unmute my own mic. Apologies for that. Karen, just a first reaction, if I might. I want to bring in our interveners from the floor, but a first reaction from you to what you've been hearing from our other speakers, adding to your key principles and the key things that you said needed to underpin this network. Questions about the implementation and what struck you about the issues that the other speakers are raising? Does it change your thinking on how we go forward?
I think Piers' point about implementation is absolutely key for me, and I think that can sometimes be some of the frustration with the decision makers who are thinking, I have these challenges in front of me that I have to face. As Peter said, we are here and now. Real world data is with us now. The question is, how do we make it into real world evidence? And I, like others, I think, have some concerns about so-called artificial intelligence, which I would perhaps call augmented intelligence in some very limited situations. So we need to get rid of the hype and focus on what we can actually do with real world data to make it into evidence that we can all do. And I think I have a slightly bigger vision than Peter in terms of the learning network. I wouldn't sort of separate it as either guidelines or data quality or specific products. I would like to see a much broader network that was bringing together not only those things, but also, you know, that the absolutely essential work that Darwin is going to do around governance and interoperability within the data space. So I'd like to see everything coming together. Now, maybe that's too much of an ambition, but that's my vision.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe we'll say, okay, within that, if you had to identify the key priorities, what would they be for you? But we'll come back on that a bit later. Let's bring in our interventions from the floor, first of all, and then I've got lots more questions for you, and our audience are already beginning to bring some in. But I wanted to turn now, if I can, and I've just given you the capacity to speak and to put your mic on, Matthias Rose, Professor and Chair at the Center for Internal Medicine and Dermatology in the Department of Psychosomatic Medicine at Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin. Matthias. Hello there.
Hi, good to see you. Good to listen, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Yes, great listening, and probably I'm invited to be a part with two hats. On one is maybe because I'm an ordinary clinician, starting with internal medicine, intensive care, and then gradually moved into the field of patient-reported outcome measures. So my real background is a little bit from the SF36. Probably people know this, and the PROMISE network, and the EORTC. So when I listen to this kind of communication, I think, well, what is the next angle to come to get this all together? Like, I like Karen's big ambition to put it all together. So what is the reason what we do within the next project? And we just got granted an award from INAMI, which is called the Health Outcome Observatory. And what we do there in the Health Outcome Observatory is basically we built on the EDEN project, which was already mentioned in the earlier session from NICE. And the EDEN project is basically trying to do a federated data analysis on existing EHR records. So this is one source, obviously, on real world evidence. So what needs to be done there is to store the data, obviously, in a common data format, which is interoperability, which is the Odyssey common data model. So we, as a charity, we are doing this at this point, and we appointed a couple of professors who are really eager to do this. Sometimes they're a little bit frustrated to do it, but they are still eager to do it. So one level, obviously, is access to the EHR data on a larger level than a small university clinic like the charity. And the next level, obviously, is access to registries. And from the clinician perspective, if I put my head on there again, it's so frustrating to punch in data, in registries, and you're not intrinsically motivated. You have to have a very academic spirit to do this. And so that's another project which we are doing, which is kind of fooling this kind of pool of real-world evidence, which is registries, which has pros and cons, obviously. And then the Health Outcome Observatory, we do a third thing, which is the main thing probably of the Health Observatory, and combining those two sources is to put the patient perspective there. So what we do is we build for Europe, and we start with 4 countries, which is the Netherlands, Austria, Spain, and Germany. We built hopefully one central hub where the patient are entering their health data, and this goes combined to the EHR system. So why I thought I was very happy to respond to this call from the EMI is because when you put the patient in the first place, I think probably it's good to think of the patients, and that's what we all do about. But it's also good for the standardization process, because we're at the stage where when we ask the patient for their health outcomes, and the WHO is proposing, what are the core domains of health, and we can agree maybe on 7 domains. When we do this right now, it's the right time to do it, because we can agree on the domains, and which is pretty easy. And we have, and this is another frustration from our RCTs, obviously, we all do know that the categorical disease system is not capturing what we do in clinical practice. We are so limited there. It's not the cancer, obviously, we're not all from cancer, but even diabetes, not the diabetes patient, and so forth. You all know this. So, but the patient naturally crosses across all those kind of disease areas. So when you ask the patient, it's by nature, you have the kind of, this is the diseases in the patient. So that's good. And the other part is when you have one hub. Yeah, when you have one hub looking for the patient perspective, I guess you can introduce the data operability standard right up front on what we do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry to hurry you, but we have so much to discuss with all these great interventions. I now would like to turn to Nicola Bedlington. Nicola, many of you will know, Special Advisor to the European Patients Forum. Nicola, I have enabled you, so we should be able to see you and your mic. I'm not seeing you at the moment. There you are, down the bottom. Could you possibly unmute your... There we are, and I can see you. It's
great. Hello.
Over to you.
Hello, Jackie. Hello, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. And I really enjoyed, Karen, your very comprehensive speech on what this project's all about. Clearly, from an EPF's perspective, health is an area where Europe can undoubtedly benefit from the data revolution, and proper use of data can increase quality, safety, patient-centeredness of healthcare systems, but also transform care into a more participatory process. It can also improve healthcare system sustainability and reduce low-value care and costs. With regard to the recommendations targeted towards patients in the documentation, we welcome these, and they resonate very well with the kind of thinking and direction of EPF and the specific work that we've undertaken in the context of projects such as Adapt Smart, Paradigm, and indeed the AIDEN project, which was mentioned just earlier. And with the backdrop of an emerging European health data space, it's indeed fundamental for patients to be involved meaningfully right from the onset. And as mentioned in the recommendations, this involvement should be structured, it should be facilitated at all levels, from shaping real-world evidence ecosystems, governance, decision-making, to implementation, data co-creation, information exchange. And it's only through this broad and systematic involvement can patient organizations really bridge the gap and bring patients closer to health data and real-world evidence, whilst ensuring appropriate ethical frameworks, protection, transparency, and fit-for-purpose consent mechanisms, all of which will be crucial to build trust. With regard to the recommendations specifically, patient organisations should indeed be empowered, but not only empowered, but also resourced to play a bigger role in the creation of real-world evidence, and in particular, capturing the outcomes that really matter to them. That they can also be contributing to inclusive methodology, including, as I mentioned, transparent, solid, informed consent. More robust data sets, which can be built through patients' inputs and insights, will support decision-making processes as the reliability of the outcomes will be higher, enhancing again trust and confidence. And this is particularly true further upstream, thinking about market authorization and HTA. Collecting the right data is only one piece of the puzzle. Patients should also have a say on how this is safely stored, used, analysed, ultimately to improve their health. And patient organisations can also play a fundamental role in providing access to unbiased, reliable information about real-world data and how this can lead to real-world evidence and their importance in the context of innovation, but also value-based healthcare per se. And more generally, patient organisations can help to build confidence and trust in responsible health data sharing among patients, but also citizens more broadly. And this is very much the rationale behind Data Saves Lives, and we're very pleased that this has been referenced in the recommendation. So all of this goes very much hand in hand with EPF's vision to ensure meaningful engagement of patients through the entire life cycle of medicines, from research prioritization right through pharmacovigilance, real-world evidence, etc., and everything in between, but also meaningful patient involvement in health systems and health services design, their delivery, but also their strengthening, particularly, and we see a lot of this in this COVID-19 era. The value of meaningfully patient involvement is really becoming more and more apparent in a real world setting. So those were my thoughts, Jackie, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots to discuss there. Let me bring in our last contribution from the floor, Ansgar Hebborn. Ansgar is Head of European Access Policy Affairs at Hoffmann La Roche, to bring us an industry perspective. I have upgraded you, Ansgar, but I don't see you yet. There we are. If you could unmute yourself, and away you go, sir. That's it.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks for the opportunity to comment on this call. I think it's a call. I think what I've heard here is certainly a lot of passionate speakers that believe there is quite some potential in real-world evidence to sort out the challenges of decision-making that we face. Drug development is changing its face in some areas, and that leaves us with decision-relevant uncertainty that we have to try to tackle. And I think relevant evidence may be able to do something in this respect. We heard that decision makers, and I think that patients are decision makers in this context. We heard that providers are decision makers in this space to understand how the use of treatment options can be optimized. And I also think that industry has to be taken as a decision maker, which, well, can make life difficult for itself by taking difficult decisions or wrong decisions in drug development, but also can make decision making easier for others if, for example, the relevant evidence is at the table. So I think it's important to consider all of these stakeholders as decision makers that have to contribute to this challenge. My industry colleague before mentioned the challenge of a very concrete product, and I think that's another important aspect, concrete experience that we share to learn. I think he exposed us to the need to develop registries, data collection mechanisms in different countries, in many different countries, for different stakeholders, their different needs, which kind of makes it very cumbersome to ultimately accumulate relevant data in a certain amount of time when it's still decision relevant. We cannot not collaborate on this space. I think that's clearly the message here. We also have heard that there is an understanding real-world evidence can answer certain things, but there are limitations. We don't completely agree where these limitations are at this point in time, but there is a need and room to make progress on understanding the opportunities and limitations of real-world evidence. And I think there's other actions that the paper of Karen Facey and her co-authors highlight, and I think we certainly share and understand at least some of those actions that need to deserve progress. In this respect, we certainly believe there is room for a learning network. I think this is what this initiative does. It calls for a learning network, for the existence of something like this, which has to be inclusive of all stakeholders, which are all decision makers, which take interdependent decisions at some point.
Okay.
It also has to be inclusive of the experience and the learnings of the other initiatives. I think it's important that we all understand that the initiatives that we already heard about are not just competing initiatives. HTX is not the same as GetReal, and it's not the same as Eden. This initiative here has put out a call for something which is aiming to be a catalyst. I think I would call it a catalyst, an accelerator of developments in this field. I think this is what we lack. We also lack transparency around the initiatives and how they support concrete decision making. And in this context, we need progress at multiple layers. We need progress on individual products.
Briefly, if you would now, Ansgar, we need to discuss all these things.
Okay, so we heard about the layer of the individual products where we need to work together, but we also need to think how we can use the learnings from there to earlier inform others that plan for evidence and decision making. I think these are layers that we need to develop and that there is a sense of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that was exactly the point I wanted to come back to, this question that Peter asked, and I'm going to ask him to answer it himself, about whether the focus is on the products or on the systems. And Karen said, Peter, she wanted to do everything. Pia talked about, and I'd like to come back to you, Pia, and ask what you meant. Maybe we need this to be an implementing network to bring all these initiatives together as much as a learning network. What is your own answer, Peter, to the scope of this network and the approach it should take?
Okay, so I'm not sure that I'm completely aligned with Karen. I think if you put everything in, you end up with a lot of noise. So I think if there is an initiative, it needs to have clear objectives, structure, a clear basis for the participation of different parties. I see the call for some funding to bring stakeholders together And I fully understand that reasoning. So let me just break it down. I think on individual products, the currently you have discussions which are confidential on individual products that are not on the market, and that goes on through scientific advice at the European Medicines Agency, and we reach out to healthcare, to HTA bodies and to payers to join that scientific advice, and that door remains wide open on specific products that are not on the market at the moment. We understand that HTA have collaborations through UNETA also in that same space, but at the moment that's largely HTA to HTA rather than crossing the different disciplines, if you like. So that's product specific, and I've got a feeling it's very radical to think that we need a whole new forum, because EMA has got a legal basis for scientific advice. It's got a whole mechanism and machinery that works very well, and I think should think twice before interfering with that. I do believe, and it's actually one of the recommendations of the Heads of Medicines Agency's EMA's Big Data Task Force, that we need a multi-stakeholder forum on the framework, if you like, for real-world evidence. And that is so that could be guidelines for studies, for protocols. It could be what do we mean by data quality framework? It could even, and this would be ambitious, be a discussion on what's the evidentiary value, what are the use cases where real-world evidence might help. And then the last sort of part, the last pillar perhaps, is the actual wording learnings initiative. We at EMA have just started a piece of work to review all of the marketing authorization applications from 2018, 2019 to see what we can learn in terms of the real world evidence that was in those applications from companies. We also intend, although we haven't started yet, to put in place prospective collection of learnings from individual applications to us as a regulator. We can also understand that as a learnings initiative, and potentially that could be multi-stakeholder. Over.
Thank you very much indeed. Karen, I'll come back to you in a little while, but I wanted to come back to Pia and your reaction to this discussion about the degree to which it's product, and Peter saying there, I think he said it's a bit radical to think that we need a whole new forum here, but he did see that role in terms of systems and the framework for real world evidence. You talked about an implementation network to bring everything together. What did you mean by that? And what's your reaction to this debate about the scope and where the focus should be? Karen's everything, or Peter's much more narrowly targeted approach?
Well, if we start with the implementation, I think we all agree that a lot has been done and a lot is ongoing, and we definitely shouldn't reinvent the wheel. So, and we've also read the sort of papers where we conclude that EU has funded many real-world data-related projects, but the implementation has been suboptimal. So I think we really need to work on implementation and keep that in mind all the time. The other thing, I sort of like the idea of keeping a broad perspective, because so many things are linked to each other. But I do acknowledge that there's real difficulties there. But what I specifically have in mind is sort of things related to cost effectiveness, economic value, managed entry agreements, and that, and I hope that that's not sort of forgotten in these discussions.
Thank you very much. And Kuba, if I could come to you on another point, please do react to this discussion so far. But Karen, in her opening presentation, talked about 3 principles. She said or key ingredients for the network. She said it must be owned by a public institution. It must enable full multi-stakeholder engagement, and it must have sustainability, i.e. long-term funding to make it work. In terms of that ownership, I think the argument, Karen, would be that it's important, vital, to build the trust in what this network is doing. For you, Kuba, do you see a role for you as policymakers, both in terms of owning this process, but also in terms of that funding issue? Because without long-term funding, it's simply not going to be sustainable. Your thoughts on that, if you would. Your mic is off.
Yeah.
There we are.
The idea of the learning network, I mean, sounds really very promising. Indeed, you know, the design, I understand it's a design for making sure that, you know, wide range of relevant stakeholders are indeed included, you know, and this, for me, it's also, I'm kind of learning now, but I can tell you, I mean, I find digital health ecosystem extremely interesting, but it's very, very complex. I mean, you have really different players here, and this is indeed essential that this type of network would have these players as part of it. For us, indeed, the key question that we would need to discuss and to hear different types of, you know, analysis responses is how, you know, how we can really make a big progress with use of data, you know, because that has been hampering us so far for a long time. Indeed, we need, I mean, I would say, you know, I think that this pandemic has come as a shock. If we look into the State of the Union, what the Commission President said about the health, you know, what was, I think, very clear message that, of course, you know, we are starting with the assumption there is very limited competence in the health area. But again, in view of what has happened, we realize how much we depend on each other, that we need really a major investment. That's why you will have also, you know, an extension of the mandate of 2 existing agencies for medicines, for disease control, and we will have also establishment of this new agency. And that ultimately means that we indeed should be slowly going in the direction of, I would say, a digital single market for health, which can encourage innovation. So again, I think that this learning network can be an excellent partner in this exercise, and, you know, we are definitely ready to engage with it and accompany its evolution. You know, at this stage, I would not be rather ready to say what type of funding support we can provide, but clearly, I mean, this priority is very much identified. We have, on top of Digital Europe program, we have a brand new Health for EU program, and I would generally see this space, you know, through which we could engage.
Thank you very much indeed. Karen, can I just come back to you, and then I want to come to the others on the key characteristics of any such network in terms of the ingredients to make it work. But just to react and on the finally on this point, 2 points really. Peter's about, he thinks it would focus on the framework. There are other places for the product specific discussion, but the framework, and Pia talking about needing to bring all these other initiatives together and really make sure there is a coherent approach. And she also talked earlier about policy learnings. It could be about policy learnings as well as more specific issues. Your reaction on both of those, and then I would like to get Pia and Peter just to talk a little bit about how they see the key characteristics of a network, and then we'll go out to the audience. Karen.
Thank you. So I think I need to clarify that the workshop we've just undertaken was simply a case study workshop. It wasn't what the real world evidence for decision initiatives intends to do in the future. It was just something that Yo said, as a payer, I'm going to commit to try to see if we can enact any of those actions. We had the Trust for RD paper, which gave us a taxonomy by which we could evaluate uncertainties which commonly faced payers. So it was a one-off. We don't know whether we'll do it again. We certainly came up with, is it overlapping what others do? But there were benefits to it as well in terms of very early dialogue involving the payers and all stakeholders, which we don't often get involved in, and a kind of potential for iterative dialogues, which is quite difficult with some of the UNETA style processes, and also a recognition from some UNETA colleagues based in UNETA that there are too many products to go through all of these processes, which could be helpful to get advice. So I think there's just that one thing, because within the paper we did identify initiatives like Data Saves Lives, that wonderful contribution there from Nicola, outlining how patients have to be central to what we do. And I'm fascinated by what's happening which is being patient-led. So I see patient organizations investing huge amounts of money in registries, working in collaboration with clinicians. But when I see them coming to make contributions to an important payer decision about a technology which they'd like to gain access to, they can't get access to the right data from the registry which they've been involved with. From the other side, I hear also the clinicians' contribution there. That really chimes with a lot of clinicians I've worked with in my research project, saying, we enter all this data, it's really time consuming. Often it's quite old fashioned, kind of, we have to type it in on an electronic CRF. It's not being automatically captured from other systems. And then what often happens is we have data collection that we then, as regulators or payers, say, actually, the data isn't good enough quality, we haven't collected sufficient data, we can't make decisions with it. So I see the burden being placed on both patients and clinicians, but then the data not actually being used or being good enough. And I just want to kind of round off some of those circles where we actually discuss openly what some of the challenges have been and how we can really resolve them. As I love Peter's idea of embracing the elephants. I'm the kind of person that would like to get all the elephants in the room. Let's have an honest discussion about them and let's see which elephants we can get rid of, or I don't want to get rid of elephants, but resolve. I like to resolve issues by openness and transparency.
In fact, just to build on that, I have one of my favorite expressions in the world, which is, if you're trying to eat an elephant, and we don't want to eat elephants, but you should take bite-sized chunks. So as you say, get them all in the room and tackle these issues one by one. But just coming back to Peter and Pia on this issue of the key ingredients to make this network work. And I just remind you again, public ownership to build that trust in the process, long-term sustainable financing, and enabling and providing that support for this multi-stakeholder engagement. Would you agree with those as the key principles? Would you add anything in order to really make this work? Peter and then Pia.
So I fully support, you need an honest broker, if you like, to run a system, a trusted broker. It needs to be funded in a sustainable way, and you need the different stakeholder groups to have an equal footing, or certainly a defined place in that forum. I would just, if I was going to, so I think your three pillars are right. If I was going to add one more, it was actually mentioned, I think, by I can't remember who, but clarity on the roles and responsibilities within that forum, and that links then to conflicts of interest. I was involved in one of the very, very early IMI projects, so public-private partnership with industry, and as a regulator, to be in a public-private industry with the industry that you regulate was considered really quite an unusual thing to do. The reason that it worked is that we had crystal clear roles and responsibilities. Conflicts were dealt with up front in legal agreements, etc., and everybody knew where they stood. So I would put the clarity on roles and conflicts as my fourth sort of semi-pillar.
So Karen, in fact, she talked about having a clear process where there are conflicts of interest. How do you manage them? And she talked about watertight governance. I wanted to come back a bit later, but I want to go out to the room in a minute on what watertight governance should look like. But Pia, just a thought from you in terms of what you really want. And I understand Kuba can't overcommit at this stage, but nevertheless, what you really want in terms of support from the policymakers. And are there any other key ingredients, do you think, to deliver on that transparency, for example, which we've talked about a little bit less so far? Anything else we need to identify as a key ingredient to make this network work? And then I'll go out to the room.
Well, I think it's really easy to agree what Peter just said. And I also think that we need to expose the network to different types of needs and motivations. So we all already collaborate amongst the regulators and HTA organizations and pharmaceutical industry, but we may need to make sure that different voices are present when we make when we collaborate. and I also think that it's really important to trust the other members so that we also can share the do not do learnings in the network, because we don't want to repeat the same mistakes that other countries perhaps already have made in their in innovative processes. Coming to sort of policy making, I think it's important to sort of separate if we are talking about policies at a national level or European level. So I think there's a lot to learn from different countries in sort of the market access processes, and how do we use data in sort of managed entry of these new products. So that's something that I would keep in mind. So when we sort of cover individual assessments, there's also space for learning in the policy context, I think.
Thank you. Kuba, if I could come to you, a question from the room, from Nigel Hughes. It is not clear that summary records, etc., for cross-border use, for instance, are not sufficient in any way to support the need for real-world data. And indeed, the EHR exchange format is a good start, but only to get through the first door or so. Do we need to go much further in terms of interoperability and harmonization?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. I mean, what can I say? I would agree with you. I mean, with the exchange format, we made an important step. But again, I think there are definitely interoperability issues that are still ahead of us that we need to sort out. There are governance issues. I really hope, I mean, that basically with this incredible, I would say this acceleration is it has really been a catalyst. There is a lot of, I think, visibility and political will generated around it. We would be able to move this forward. And I think the whole project of European health data space means also that we would be moving from, if you look at the exchange format for health records, this was after all just a recommendation. But I think if you want to build a real system when medical data can flow and with respect of the rules, indeed we need a fully fledged data governance enshrined in European legislation. I think this is something that we are going to work on. This is what Commission President actually has announced in her speech this week. So yes, I think that would be the way how we can do it. It cannot be just based on a sort of goodwill or memorandum of understanding and cooperation. We need a very solid legal framework for that.
Thank you very much. On the issue of data quality, which we talked a lot about in the first panel, question saying, what is the plan and timelines for key stakeholders to issue clear and concise recommendations on how data quality and data fitness for purpose will be evaluated? Can anybody help on that point?
I can try, Jackie. So a week ago, the European Medicines Agency and the heads of the national agencies published the work plan of the Big Data Steering Group. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, have a look at our website. It was described by one press journalist as ambitious, and it also comes with a big caveat that we may need to change some of the deadlines if COVID-19 planning, and we all have to reallocate the staff to be assessing applications, etc. But in that application, we will be launching, in that work plan, we'll be launching work before the end of the year on a data standardization strategy with a view to adopting, as medicines regulators, a data standardization roadmap in 2022. And in the course of that work, we will be reaching out across the spectrum of stakeholders to see what the different needs are. So I think that partly goes to Nigel Hughes's question. In terms of data quality, we, in the first quarter next year, will be launching an external study to get an academic or a service provider to review what is already the state of the art in terms of data quality. We know that the Eden project, and Nigel Hughes again is in your audience, is doing work in that area. Harvard Pilgrim in the US is doing work in that area. But as regulators or as HTA or as payer, what do we mean by data quality, and can we have a common understanding? Because that will then drive the data elements and the way data is collected, going back to Karen's impassioned speech about patients collecting data and then them not being decision supportive, if you like. So we would hope then in 2022 to have a data quality framework for regulators, which would at least be informed by the needs of other stakeholders. Over.
Comments to this? Anybody like to come in on this point? Okay, yes, please, Karen.
I think Kuba wanted to come in as well. I was just going to say that obviously UNETA, EMA have produced guidance on things like registries, but I think this is where we go back to it depends on the question. And I think that's at the heart of everything, that what we need is the same rigor around real world data analysis that we have in clinical trials. So as a number of us have talked about, we've talked about protocols, we've talked about statistical analysis plans. Peter Moll also talked about it's not exploratory analysis, which was how real world data used to be used. It used to be used for hypothesis generation. If we want to use it to make decisions, it has to have watertight process. And I think within that, that means we need to understand that how we actually select the data from a retrospective chart review, or we draw it down from administrative databases, is really important. So perhaps we not only need publication of protocol and statistical analysis plan, but also the data extraction. That's absolutely key. And we need to be able to test that. So this is hugely complex, but I would like to see those documents published as we do with a clinical trial registry.
Any other comments to this from Pierre or Kuba before we move to another question? No. Okay. Linking to your comment about clinical... Sorry, yes, Peter.
Yeah, one tiny thing, because my little brain had a lapse, just because it may be of very high interest to the people participating in this conference. EMA, before the end of this week, will be publishing a guideline on studies in patient registries for public consultation. So it draws on a number of the points that people have been making about the important role of registries, but the need to get it right. So colleagues, look out on the EMA website later this week, because we want to hear your views on that draft guidance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And linking to your point about clinical trials, a question here from the audience, from Thomas Bowles. I think we all agree that clinical trials are the gold standard, or the king and queen. I think that was a phrase that Peter used earlier, the queen, he said, for approval. However, as some already mentioned, in ultra-orphan medicines, this is not possible. There are just not enough patients for clinical trials that can be powered sufficiently to get statistically meaningful results. We are coming to the question here. Also, with some new ATMP technologies, placebo-controlled trials cannot be conducted as the mode of administration is very visible and complicated. Should we, for those cases, urgently agreed on what real-world evidence should be provided and how, and uniformly across the EU? So should we take those cases where the need is greatest and deal with that first? Reactions, comments on that? Who would like to come in? Karen?
In a sense, I think that's what we did. So that was our demonstration project, was highly innovative technologies. And we were certainly thinking about the cell therapies and the gene therapies. But I think it's also good to challenge when people say, even with small populations, we can't have a randomized controlled trial, because if you have a really curative effect and a transformative effect, you only need a small number of patients to show that effect. And we've actually seen, for example, some gene therapies that have done very small randomized controlled trials and demonstrated substantial benefit. So I still think we need to question this. I recognize there are the cases where we need uncontrolled evidence, but then we're looking for external comparators, and we often don't understand the natural history of the disease in these ultra rare conditions. So I think companies are increasingly recognizing that actually the RCT may be easier if they can do it in any sort of way. And I think we're seeing different methodologies for RCTs now, where we have a shorter observation period and then a switching. So we need to keep this all in mind. It's not straightforward.
Thank you. If I could just read a comment from someone in our audience, from Michael Ermisch from GKV Spitzenverband, saying, knowing it took years to implement the joint scientific advice with EMA and HTA, it seems key to start inclusion of other stakeholders to product-specific discussions as soon as possible. The pandemic is a practical hindrance, but payers already responded very positively to EMA's regulatory science proposal, which announced the invitation of payers. That said, development of methodology and prospectively planned trials are key to build confidence that biases inherent to non-randomized data can be dealt with. Would anyone like to react to that? Peter, do you have a comment to that?
Yes, yes, yes. So door open to payers and scientific advice. Obviously, when the relevant pharmaceutical company is open to that, because it's a company specific product. So, and just go back to Karen, I agree with absolutely every breath that Karen said in terms of controlled trials versus observational data in single arm trials. There will be certain situations where you can't have a controlled trial, but if you can, do.
Can I just come back on an issue that Karen talked about right at the beginning and has been alluded to by a number of you, to do with the governance? And you called, Karen, for watertight governance. And we've also heard, and Peter also underlined, this clarity, this importance that you have real clarity on who does what, who's responsible, what the role of each player is. What, for each of you, does watertight and good open governance of a network like this really mean? What would it look like? What should it look like? Karen, you raised the issue in your opening presentation, so could you just build on that a bit in terms of how it should look, and then reaction perhaps come to Pia next and then to the others? Karen.
I don't think I've got any good answers to this question, but I see it at two levels. Firstly, at the data access level, from the very simple situation of, in my own country, we find it hard enough to link across data sets, whereas I'd love to link to Fin data and all the other data out there, but that is a challenge, and I'm hoping the Commission is going to resolve that issue for us. We in the UK may not be involved, but hopefully the rest of Europe will benefit from that. So I see governance around all the kind of data access issues. And then I think Peter really hit the nail on the head with roles and responsibilities, because as everybody knows, I'm an advocate for patient involvement, but I'm also an advocate for transparency, that actually decision makers are having to make the decision for the whole of their population, and a patient group may have a specific interest, and we need to work with them in an appropriate way to recognize who has responsibility for what and who can do what action. And I'll leave it there.
Kuba, perhaps you could come in on this point of the governance of the data access issue and what needs to be done to ensure that we get this absolutely right.
I mean, I was looking at this from a wider perspective, that we have this common data spaces project where we basically will have to create, I mean, we want to create a system which would cover, you know, such widely divergent areas as manufacturing, agriculture, digital government. And I think what comes very clearly to me is that there is definitely no one size fits all. Health is really, really special. You know, there is a long tradition also of there is a high degree of national sensitivity for a good reason. I mean, the national health system have been organized, obviously, in a very, if you look from a European perspective, in a highly heterogeneous manner. We have clearly, of course, you know, the foundation in terms of data protection, like GDPR, but to get it right, I think we would indeed, you know, be, we have to show a lot of responsiveness to this sensitivity. I do imagine that, you know, as part of developing this project of common health data spaces, you know, the engagement with national health authorities, with the patient organizations. So I would say also, I mean, with all of you would be critical. I mean, I can only tell you that we would be very, very, I would say, prudent to get things right. So one thing is respecting obviously sensitivities of national authorities and member states, but it is of utmost importance that we actually will win the trust of patients. We can say that as a result of COVID, there is a more openness because, for example, telemedicine, which could have been seen as a nuisance, might have been really, a right way, a safe way of receiving medical advice. Nevertheless, if we make steps forward, it's very easy actually to have all sorts of strange stories expanding. We saw it in many areas, like how, for example, certain fears are being exploited in relation different area, 5G, and we would need a very, I would say, not just a solid consultation process, but also a powerful communication campaigns, which, frankly speaking, at European level, you can do a bit, but ultimately it's going to happen at a national level so that actually people would understand what will happen with their data and can, give some trust. But it's not going to be easy, and clearly trust on this issue could be in many instances part of a wider issue of trust of public policies and governments.
Pia, did you want to come in on this point and the broader point about watertight governance and what it looks like?
Well, perhaps at this point, I would like to comment on the roles again. So I think it's safe to say that the use of real world data in healthcare decision making is here. And I'm certainly looking at this from a national level and from sort of the HTA payer decision making perspective. And I just think that the national policymakers have an important role in enabling sort of the use of real world data and real world evidence in decision making, and that's where I see the role in the learning network, where we sort of jointly identify the good practices and learn from others in improving our processes and sort of trying to get affordable access to safe and effective medicines. I think that's the key in all of our work.
Thank you. Peter, unless you've got something burning to say, there are two specific questions to you, which I'd like to put to you. It's great to hear from Peter, says the questioner. This is Thomas Bowles again. Great to hear from Peter that EMA will undertake a data quality project to get to a common understanding for regulators about what is meant by quality of data. What about involving HTA bodies, or at least working with them to ensure there is a common understanding across regulators and HTA bodies? And also one on data standardization at EU level. How can the payer interact on this topic? So two very specifically for you, really.
On both, I make a commitment here today that on both the data quality project and, forgive me, quick mental block, there was data quality, what was the other one, Jackie?
I've just deleted them, so now you've given me a mental block.
Make it more general on the two projects that I discussed earlier.
Involving HTA bodies much more, and the payers.
Yeah. And there were two different projects. I commit now that on both work streams, there will be outreach to HTA and to payers, and we will listen very carefully to the needs and perspectives, because if we can come up with common data elements, for example, or common principles, then that's a win-win, isn't it? Because then we can have one registry that meets the needs of medicines regulators as well as HTA as well as payers, or one way of patient-reported outcomes coming in, something like that. So it's a commitment today. Can I just go back to your governance? I would come up with three. Overall transparency, with transparency of funding in particular, detailed conflict of interest rules, agreed roles and responsibilities with, if you like, the right to be heard of all of the relevant stakeholders, and particularly the role of industry to be crystal clear, because sometimes the sensitivities about industry's role can be paralyzing, and that's where the greatest sensitivities lie. Over.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here which actually feeds nicely into our closing minutes, and I wanted to try and identify some key next steps. We are going to have a session in a moment on the way forward. But the question comes from Bernard Grimm, who says, what would be the pragmatic recommendations from our panel speakers to move the real-world evidence world from pilots to routine structural processes? Should we implement best practices, invest in better data infrastructures, or work on the alignment of stakeholders in the process? I think you're going to say all of the above is probably the basic answer, but that really led into my closing question, which is for you, of all the issues we've discussed in this panel and in the previous one, what for you is the most important key next step, the priority to, as Bernard just said, to move from the pilots to making this routine, to move from the theoretical to the very practical and implement, to use the word Pia said. Let me come, Pia, to you first this time. A specific response on Bernard's question, but for you, your most important priority for action.
Well, I would first start with the national level action. I think it's really important to clarify the roles of different stakeholders at the national level with regard to the use of real world data in decision making, because I see that's the way of like improving implementation of these learnings that we get from European collaborations. And then in the European level, I think I would first seek to better understand what member benefits different stakeholders are expecting from perhaps this learning network, if that would be implemented.
Thank you. Kuba, key priority.
Yes, I wouldn't say probably anything new, but the key priority is no doubt, from our perspective, from the perspective of DigiConnect, is to have a secure accessibility of health data across the EU. I mean, this is really for us, let's say, where we can actually add value. Now we have a range of financial instruments on the table, part of new MFF. So we have Recovery Resilience Facility, we have Digital Europe program, we have Connecting Europe Facility, which could be also relevant in terms of connecting infrastructure of member states, Horizon Europe and EU for Health. So my priority would be that, member states, but also the other stakeholders, come up with ideas, what is the best investment, and notably with these national recovery plans coming forward, I would like that this issue is also addressed there, and I think this is really a task for the coming months.
Thank you very much indeed. Peter.
Kuba is my new best friend, by the way, just for the record.
I'm glad we managed to. Collaboration in action.
Hi, Kuba. Severe accessibility for health data across the EU. Yes, yes, yes. Number one priority. Totally agree. If I got to go for one thing there, within that framework, people will have heard the regulators talking about Darwin EU, which is essentially in the area of medicines regulation. But I put it to you that if we plan it right, the benefits could be HTA and payers, and then of course, ultimately patients, and it would support a learning healthcare system. So Darwin EU as a pathfinder project for the European health data space, delivering secure accessibility of health data across Europe. Over.
Thank you very much. And Karen, coming back to you, and you started by talking what is a learning healthcare system, and you enumerated many challenges, many issues to address. And then you said, I want this network to address all of them. I want it all to be there. But if I was being mean and said, you got to pick one, you got to pick one priority, or maybe it's a key next step to realize the network, to make it actually happen. What for you would that priority, that key next step be?
The priority for me is something that was talked about in the first session, which is upskilling. An essential element of a learning healthcare system is that every member of staff within a health system becomes an expert in quality improvement at their own level. So you have highly trained quality improvement experts at the most senior level leading, but every member of staff understands what quality improvement is. And I think we somehow need that around real world data. We all need to understand what it is, how it's gathered, But there are certain people who will become experts in it, who will become methodological experts. There are people like Kuba who are doing all the governance bits. We all need to have some basic understanding, but we need some transparency whereby we can share the case studies to say, actually, you know, we commissioned this real world evidence study from the US. We paid a lot of money for it, but actually it's been hugely criticized because there were many flaws with it. And we actually need to have those conversations and say, how could we have done that differently? Could we have collaborated across Europe to commission a better study? So upskilling at all levels, and I think particularly within the HTA payer community, because it's the issues of real world evidence analytics are not straightforward, and we all need to learn from one another.
And on that note, I would normally ask the audience to join me in thanking the panel. They can't in the virtual world, so I'm going to do it for them. Thank you so much. We could have gone on with this discussion for hours, but we did nevertheless manage to cover a lot of ground and answer almost, I think, every question that came in. So a big thank you to all of you for your contributions and for your clarity of thought and your vision for where we go from here. So we are almost at the end of this conference, but before we close, I wanted to give the floor to two people. First, to Joe de Kock to come back and give us his reflections, brief reflections on the way forward. And then we will hear from Andre Rees again. So, Joe, are you there? Joe, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm there.
You can. I can't see you though, Joe, at the moment.
Yes,
There we are. Hello,
okay.
sir. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think this meeting was also considered as being a little bit a tryout to see, okay, what's the reaction of a greater audience about the approach of building on learning networks. What I learned is very clear. I think we are in a momentum for different reasons. There are different possibilities we can use for realize this call for action as we have considered this project creating a learning network. I think it's the right time to do so, and as most people have stressed, together we can achieve more. Working together, bundle forces, align different initiatives, bringing together the pieces of a broader puzzle. Puzzle, you can call it also an ecosystem, because there are a lot of players who are playing a role, and therefore good coordination is needed. That's a broader puzzle, of course, a broader picture than only a learning network. It's clear that we have the duty to unlock the potential of the data we are collecting. We can collect them better. We have to analyze them in a proper way, and we have to define clear research questions. And I think the important steps are notions like evidence generation plans all over the life cycle of products. How can we create that on an clever way, on an important way, in order to build the necessary evidence we need and to resolve the uncertainties we are confronted with. Of course, there are a lot of contextual elements we have to put in place. It's clear that data policy in general, but also and especially also in healthcare, data quality and data governance are key to achieve more results in the healthcare as in general, but also in decision making in new technologies. It's clear that these evidence plans, and I think it's what Peter Arlett to stress it, should be prospective. When we have introduced also elements of horizon scanning, okay, together with that, we should already thinking about collecting data, not collecting data, reflecting which data we need to resolve the research questions we want to be resolved. It's not a question of gathering data, it's a question of evidence building and having the right questions. We should do that for and with patients, taking into account, of course, the different roles regulators and payers have, but nevertheless, the voice of the patients are key. I think it's important to get a lot of interest, not only in the regulatory sector, as I can call it, but also in the payer one, which is related to outcomes, and also to show if there's value for money when we are taking the decisions. These are questions are coming up, and especially in an economic context, which are we confronted with in the next years, more and more these questions will come up. Of course, it should be, when we are taking initiatives, they should have public trust. We have said, okay, a public authority. No, public trust, that's the key question, unbiased and decisions or orientations or initiatives which are unbiased. Of course, this needs an investment. This needs to be clarified, but we have the duty to do so. And I've put some questions here in order to clarify eventual way forwards. I think we have clearly heard that there is a usefulness of a multi-stakeholder approach, and it should be go together with robust methodologies, but also with concrete actions. It's a multi-level approach, multi-layer approach, as you have said, and I think it's important to have indeed interest for methodologies, but also interest for actions and interest in analyzing data and so on. I think that's important thing. Second thing is, can the EU play a role? I think that of course, it's a question for Andre. I will not respond in his place, but I think the legislation is already allowing that voluntary cooperation mechanisms between member states based on a good strategy, which we will explore in the coming weeks and months. I think that should be possible. There should be also sufficient political endorsement. Otherwise, we cannot achieve necessary sustainability. And we know that in the Council of Ministers, a lot of discussions are going on last years about pharmaceuticals and HTA. I think we should also propose and suggest to invest and to endorse initiatives as the Learning Network, together with other initiatives, and integrate it where possible to have a common approach. We are not a standalone initiative. It's a collaboration with others can only leading to good results. And that's last point, the alignment with the other initiatives. I think that to join forces, avoid duplications, and putting, of course, intelligence and capacity where it can be delivered. I think that's something we should do. And when we bring these puzzles together, sitting together with other initiatives, with the European Commission, with our colleagues of other member states, but also with other stakeholders, I think we can come to a concrete proposal based on what we have heard today. And that's what we want to realize in the upcoming period, knowing that we have other meetings, and we are very grateful, for instance, that the German presidency hosted a meeting also, which is linked to this, not only to this project, but to this problem and to this issue. And I think that we should make profit of this occasion to have more concrete steps which can be put forward later on. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. Lots of issues to go on discussing, but lots of concrete outcomes from today that you highlighted so very clearly there. It's now my pleasure to give the floor back to Andre Ries for some closing thoughts on the way forward. Andre.
Okay.
can hear you, can't see you at the moment. There you are, sir.
Okay, so good afternoon for all. I was really interested to hear all these comments, and panels and exchange during the day. If I may conclude at least what I learned today and action to be done. So let me start from the first statement because I was asked, why I didn't mention patients as important stakeholders. So I promise myself that I will, of course, say, and Peter already said what I will repeat, for patients and with patients. So this is the mantra we have. I am patient myself as well, so I really feel, I have to do something for myself as well. This is the non-conflict of interest statement. But what is important, I think, it's something what I think Karen said, that we really have to do somehow we do a little bit learning by doing. There is a limit of everything we know. We don't know many answers yet, but if we will not try, we will not get anywhere. So I understand we can make mistakes, we can still learn, and this is, I think, the concept of learning network. I always agreed and happy to support. But maybe I can also add that most probably should be network of networks, because my feeling is about an experience as well, that I agree with Karen that all these networks, they have own culture. They keep also the kind of internal knowledge. They have problem, with accepting others for a number of reasons. So my understanding is now that we really have to kind of make sure that networks are connected and they can work together. For example, when I am co-chairing meetings with European Reference Networks, coordinators or member states, we often discuss, how those networks can be connected to EMA networks, to the experts, involved in the operation, how the registries can be used differently. So somehow we already try to make interlink, and there are some good examples. Maybe somebody asked, what is better strategy? Learning by examples, good practices. I think we should continue to gather those practices and share them. This is maybe the third element. I think it's important as a building blocks, not just learning by doing, not only networking, network of networks, but also learning by example, learning by cases. So we should continue to gather them and publish or share and so on. The next element is the who is in the system, and how important is the trust. I think we mentioned so many times today trust as the important element, and also transparency. I think we use like the T-Day because we have also transformations. I think trust, transformation, transparency. So this is other element of those development, which already you also kind of mentioned in his final. And last, maybe 2-3 observations. So I think we should. I think in discussion you mentioned something which I like. We should expose those learning networks or network of networks to the different challenges and future challenges already mentioned. At least on the EU political level, we will see as I already mentioned in my introduction today, European health data space is a venture, but also is a joint venture, because we would like as many participants as possible to participate in this project. Of course, we have to define rules and the governance and the number of regulatory, most probably, measures. But of course, we can do this better if we know what for and what is the objective of this future European space. And I strongly believe you cannot design this without taking account way we see this answering also to Jan's question, you know, interconnectivity between European initiatives, European health data space, European pharma strategy, but also HTA, and of course without stakeholders, without member states, this will not fly. So I think the next few months, most probably next full year, this will be very important also area of cooperation, including also with this network of networks, and data will be the big hopefully big winner as well. But we should not leave with the illusion that this will be easy gain. I hope, you know, working together, working, you know, closely, transparent way, we can meet our challenges. So thank you very much for today. It was also very good learning opportunity for me, for also my colleagues who participated in this.
Thank you to you, Andre, and thank you for listening throughout the discussion. We really do appreciate it. And as you say, lots of difficult issues to address, but we have begun, we've touched on some of them, we've charted some ways forward today. I'd just like to thank all our speakers this afternoon for their great contributions to our discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for your fascinating questions and comments, and for staying with us throughout this discussion. The outputs of this meeting, Joe mentioned there will be other meetings, and crucially, the outputs of this meeting are going to feed into a high-level conference on November the 10th in Brussels and online, hosted under the German Federal Ministry of Health associated program within the German presidency. Registration for this event is open. You can see the link in the chat box now, but you can also go to the website. You see the website address at the bottom of the screen, www.rwe4decisions.com. You can go to the website to register, or click on the link now and do it immediately. And at that event, a call for action with clear policy asked will be launched based on this meeting and the real world evidence for decision stakeholder actions. I'll have the privilege of moderating that discussion as well, so I do hope you can join us. In the meantime, thank you all very much once again. May I wish you a very pleasant evening and stay safe. Goodbye.